Hello, everyone. Hey, Ben. I think you're still on mute. Yes, there you
Yeah, I
are.
just unmuted myself. Cool.
How are you doing tonight?
Doing pretty good. Yeah, just
Yeah,
enjoying my lockdown at home. But
nice.
yeah, love to be here. It's good to be here. How about yourself? You enjoying yourself at home all these
Yeah,
days?
very well, actually. I don't know if you have been following me a little bit, but we're trying to keep ourselves slightly busy with some house projects we're doing. So,
It's quite
yeah,
depressing though, because
chilling.
I saw something the other day on Twitter saying, "Hey, it's depressing to know that with the lockdown, I haven't had to change much in my life." So same thing for me, I
Yeah,
guess. Only one
yeah.
more sign that I have no social life, I suppose.
Yeah, that's true. I'm missing the social interaction. Further, I'm doing more than ever workout wise and in and around the house. I have to admit.
Yeah. Well, one thing is for sure though, been a lot busier than before. So work has been going crazy, like even more than before. So that's a good thing. And I'm happy that a lot of people in our industry are also being able to stay busy. There's a lot of people have lost their jobs, so it's a good thing that at least for us in the tech industry, we have the security to be able to work from home and to get stuff done. So. Um, I think Yos is having some connection issues, right? At least he's frozen for me. I don't know if I can see anything on the chat right now. Are you guys seeing Yo's frozen as well? Yep. Oh well. Oh, he's back. There he is.
I'm back. Sorry about that. My internet
I
cut out
thought you
for
died
a
for a moment,
sec.
man.
No, all good, all good.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, sorry. I also don't want to keep the people waiting, of course. So I want to give it away to you. The only thing I wanted to say quickly to the audience, we are doing these. Virtual meetups for now on a weekly basis. Next week we will have a Angular special. Maybe not as maybe not as popular with this crowd, but I still hope you can enjoy it. Next week at 7 we'll start, because we actually would have had Angular NL conference at the 1st of May, but of course due to circumstances that will not be able to take place. So still hope that people will enjoy Angular NL next week with Manfred Steyer, Michael Klatke, Harris Dexnis, Natalia Vendido, and Chubby Lamis will be speaking. So it's a really cool meetup, a really cool lineup, and I really hope that people can enjoy it. Further, I want to give it over to you, Ben. Ben is our consultant and developer. He's involved with a lot of things we do with the conference as well for passionate people. And Passionate People is the brand behind all of this that makes these meetups and conferences possible. So please, Ben, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Yos. Yeah, what can I say after this introduction? So we have some amazing speakers. I was gonna say tonight, but I guess I have to be mindful of the time difference, because I guess we have people from all over the world who are watching us today. The very first speaker that we have today is Ahmad. I'm actually gonna bring him over with us, and there you go. I think I just unmuted him. Hey, Ahmad, welcome.
Howdy, folks.
Yeah, so we are very honored to have Ahmad with us today. He's a Google developer expert. I guess he helps Google to come up with their products and improve their products, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the many.
Happy to be here.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, so amongst that, some of the things that he does, he's an active committee member of the Node.js Foundation. And I think previous to that, he was also a senior developer advocate for Cloudinary, right? So I think I got it correctly.
Yeah, sure thing.
Yeah. So Ahmad's going to be with us today. And Ahmad, can you just give us a little hint of what you're going to be talking about?
Sure. So I love the open source community, and mostly a pure web purist, if you will. So I've been building a lot of websites lately with Next.js in the JAMstack community, JavaScript API and markups. So Next.js has just grown into this huge framework where you can have, page basis static site generation or server side generation or client side rendering, and I'm going to talk about a complex project that I handled last year where I ended up using all three of these: Node.js, React.js, and Vue.js. And I hope you are going to enjoy that.
Yeah, awesome. And I mean, you used JAMstack, right? To pull it off. Awesome. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to it. This format's a little bit different than what you guys are used to because there was a lot of preparation that went into this talk. And so it is pre-recorded, but Ahmad's going to be here the entire time, and he's also going to answer some questions should you guys have it. I'm sure you will, because I already have some at the end of his talk. So without any more delays, we're going to play it out. So I'm going to take our cameras off screen. Yos, I think you have to set the loopback output so we can hear the audio as well on the video. Yeah, there's no audio right now, so I can see Yos right now on his camera. He's got this big drop of sweat coming off his face, trying to figure this out. Yeah, well, in the meantime, while he's getting that on, maybe Ahmad and I can just have a quick chat while Yos is trying to get the video up and going, because right now we have no audio. So, but Ahmad, what was the motivation with JAMstack?
I've been building a lot of web throughout. I think I started back in 2002. So web has been growing in this way where everyone was kind of using WordPress, and I remember learning PHP because of WordPress. And I used to be that guy who used to run the JavaScript channel for WordPress, and when JavaScript was not really cool, and nowadays, like it's happening. What's happening is Amazon Web Services and many other websites that have kind of taken backend away from you. They're managing it for you. But on the sake of, when it comes to front end, you end up doing it all alone with React.js, Angular, or Vue.js, or wherever whatever fits the bill for you. Hello, everybody.
Oh, there it is. We got it working.
I'm audible.
But yeah, I mean, I really like the JAMstack though, because I remember back in the day, it was all about the server side rendering, right? I needed to learn that, and then when I learned about the power that you get from a static website, that's what really got me into this. But anyways, we got the video going, so I guess we can let our attendees enjoy it now. So cool. I'm going to turn off our cameras so we can proceed.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ahmad Awais, and I'm going to be talking about performant JAMstack. And we are really close. And I think performance is one thing that goes hands in hand with JAMstack. But what does it really mean? How can you really build something with JAMstack that has performance built in? This is sort of what I did last year, and I'm going to be telling you about it. For example, what I built was called a developer activation, where you build something for developers and try to activate that community to use your product or your API. I had to make a lot of decisions on front end, back end, what kind of back end and what kind of front end I was going to use, and especially how I'm going to build the documentation. I'm Ahmad Awais. I love open source community, a Google developers expert, and I also serve on the Node.js community committee. I've written a lot of open source software, several software libraries that are being used by millions of developers, which is truly humbling for me. And if it is not already apparent, I love emojis. You can definitely find me on Twitter at Mr. Ahmad Awais. This is the sort of platform where I hang out. I use Twitter as a mini blog where I blog daily, and I share all kind of jokes and rants there, and my hashtag #1DevMinute videos to kind of teach you one thing about something development related in 1 minute. I also created this VSCode.pro course. If you want to step up your programming skill set or how you can code a lot more in less time, definitely check out this course. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Enough about me already. You're here to talk about JAMstack and talking about yourself. Okay, let's move on to what I'm here to talk about. Today I'm talking about CloudyCam.dev. It's actually a Cloudinaries developer activation that I built last year. To take a look at this activation, this is what it actually looks like. So we go to all of these conferences and different meetups. For example, here is this JAMstack conference London that we went to last year. We have an actual physical photo booth there where we take your pictures and generate these demo pages, which you see right now in front of you. For example, a particular demo page looks just like this, where I explain what Cloudinary can do for you. It has a very simple transformation-based URL API. For example, if you say w_500, your image is going to be 500 pixels in width. And if you say quality auto and format auto, it would generate auto format, the best format for your user. For example, WebP might be the best format for Chrome, but not for Mozilla Firefox. And it kind of goes ahead and figures these things out on its own. And then in the demo page, we showcase these images that we took. A professional photographer we have there who is taking your pictures. And I also kind of build these demos on how you can use these different URL parameters to do something like this, put text over your images or do funky stuff with your images or whatnot. For example, you could also build these awesome cool looking image effects and whatnot. Anywho, back in action, this is actually, CloudyCam is actually an Internet of Things. We have a real life actual camera DSLR connected to our setup. And I was the prime architect of this project. I designed and developed this entire thing, the API, the architectural designs. They were on my code. And I ended up choosing JAMstack, which is what I'm going to kind of explain in this entire talk, why and what I did there. Also, this is a progressive web app. You can actually use it offline or some of it. I love progressive web apps, so why not? Okay, so let's talk about the project requirements. So the project requirements for this project were really simple. You take a picture, you upload it to Cloudinary, and you build a demo page. At the moment there, I was thinking easy peasy, lemon squeeze. But I'm this developer. I spent a lot of part of my career building awesome developer experience. And a good developer experience, I believe, comes from an equilibrium or a balance between a good developer experience and a good operational experience. I believe if your product just has a good developer experience, it is not going to be successful if it does not have a good operational experience at the same time, both for your consumers, which those could be developers, or for observers, who are just in the orbit of your application or your product or your SaaS company and kind of are observing how people are operating around your company or around with your product. I think these two things working together can improve your product really well. So what started to happen was, as I told you, I had built this website, this developer activation with a JAMstack. And most importantly, in JAMstack, you generate these pages pretty much statically. So let's say if you have 600 demo pages, what would happen if you add another demo page to it is that builder would just again run, and it will take about 2 or 3 minutes for all of these pages to be generated again because of the addition of a new page. And that is a less than optimal, developer and operational experience. Because, for example, imagine you come to our photographer and the photographer takes your pictures. And then you come to me and ask, Awais, when am I going to get these pictures? I think all of this thing would take about 15 or so seconds. Whereas our static site generator is still working out its way and generating your demo. What am I supposed to tell you then? That is sort of what started happening at our photo booth. There would be this huge traffic of developers waiting for their demo pages to be built. And that was not a good developer experience or a good operational experience per se. So I ended up with this budget of 15 seconds. I had to build a new demo page in less than 15 seconds. That was a hard requirement. And then these requirements kind of started to grow. For example, we had these multiple demos out of one particular event working on something, working on generating your demo pages simultaneously. And to, make it more complex, we then started to have simultaneous events with multiple demos at multiple events working simultaneously. This kind of grew out of hand really quickly. And this was, I felt at the moment, this was my developer experience at the time. I felt like, okay, this JAMstack idea is good, but I'm unable to scale it. And JAMstack is about performance. And if a JAMstack application becomes a laggy, really slow stack as you start to scale, you kind of start to wonder what the community is excited about. Is it, is JAMstack only helpful if you're building a small marketing site and not something that is dynamic, not something that is your blog? What is really happening here? You see, I had to make a lot of decisions again. What kind of front end am I going to use? The backend I'm going to use? How I'm going to produce, the documentation and whatnot? If you don't know it yet, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed at the time. So here's what I did. I started to work on the details of what is actually JAMstack. JAMstack is not actually stack. This is what I found out. JAMstack is this idea of a stack. It is still in its infant phase. It is still evolving, and it needs your help. It needs my help to become what it should be. The idea is just that you use JavaScript, APIs, and Mark. Why? For example, JavaScript I consider as a really good language, a really good programming language that is sometimes fun to use. I also believe that JavaScript has a good deal of high-paying jobs, and I consider myself a futurist. I want to live on the cutting edge of technology. I build and demo or open source stuff that is really new to the community. And that is sort of where JAMstack exists. It's sort of the cutting edge thingy using, JavaScript APIs and markup. And JavaScript kind of helps me be this futurist because I believe JavaScript is running after really cutting edge solutions. We are changing the language itself on and off in other amazing features. Whereas API could be anything, an application programmable interface. At the very crux of it, an API is like a waiter. For example, imagine you go to a restaurant and the chef is in the kitchen and you're sitting out there in their, dining area. You order your food from the chef. What you do is the waiter comes to you, especially if it is not a fast food restaurant. A waiter comes to you, and that waiter gives you the, that recipe, the menu, where you can see all of the dishes that a chef in the kitchen is going to make for you. Then you tell your decision to that waiter that, okay, I'm going to eat this thing. And then that waiter takes your demands to the kitchen, to the chef, and gets that dish built, gets that dish cooked, and then brings it back. So in this entire scenario, that waiter is actually an API, which is allowing you, the customer, the client, and the chef, the server, to communicate between each other. So in API, what happens is we generally have these endpoints that are built by these awesome backend engineers. In 2020, nowadays, what has started happening is that I personally believe that API has started to becoming, for example, API right now is a function to UI. UI kind of dictates what API should look like. It's not the other way around. And that is sort of where GraphQL comes in. Instead of going back and forth with your backend engineers, asking for more endpoints with different kind of data, what you can actually do is you can use GraphQL and use the existing endpoints to create multiple resolvers that would resolve your queries the way you want without having to hit multiple endpoints at the same time or, kind of really growing these backend folks or dev folks and fighting with them for having an API that would change as soon as your UI changes. So that's API. And then the third component of JAMstack is markup. I think it is the most ignored component. I don't know why, but I really love Markdown. So Markdown is, sort of a markup, which is converted to HTML on the runtime, on the build time. And I use Markdown everywhere. You can use MDX, you can use, Pug, Mustache, Handlebar, whichever fits the build for you. I use Markdown everywhere. I use Markdown on GitHub to create the READMEs. I use Markdown to write the emails, write my newsletters, write my blog post. And even right now, what you are looking at is a Go language-based presentation template that I built. And I only had to write Markdown for this particular area that you see. This is all generated through Markdown. I don't need to create this again and again for every presentation that I do. Markdown is really good. You should definitely invest more time in learning it. Okay, now that I had understood what JAMstack really means, I wanted to start looking at what was not really trending, but what would fit really well with my use case here. What I really needed from my front end was a really good first-class routing support. So I can send anyone to anyone's demo page really quickly and have more control on how that demo page is built. For example, my page would be cloudycam.dev/Awais. I wanted more control on this page in this route. I also needed server-side rendering along with the static-side generation. I wanted to use my server because otherwise what was happening was I was stuck with 2 to 3 minutes of build time every single time a new demo was created. And remember, I had a budget of 15 seconds per demo page. And a good to have here was a progressive web app. So I went out to the community and I started to look for the options, and everyone was kind of recommending Gatsby.js. Gatsby has this impressive documentation and this support for React and GraphQL. But what I felt was missing in Gatsby was routing support. You see, routing is sort of a second-year citizen in Gatsby, and that was not really fitting well with the model that I had been building. It was not scaling well with the JAMstack. A little bit more research, and I end up with Next.js. And to my surprise, Next.js has more stargazers on GitHub than Gatsby.js. Maybe this is something you care about. Or maybe if you take a look at Built With, I probably saw that Next.js was being used for more dynamic websites than the static ones, but it had this hybrid nature. It has a very well thought out routing support that was, from where I stood, it felt right. It was done right. And then it has what we call a hybrid JAMstack. So you can either build a particular page statically with their static site generator, or you can use their static part generator to dynamically fetch different pages at the build time, and then fall back to server-side rendering, which is amazing. For example, let me show you how. So in Next.js, they have React components-based pages. For example, if you go into the Next.js pages directory and create an about.js page, which would look like a simple React component like this, it would be readily available on the route of yourdomain.com/about. So a React component, a file-based React component, kind of translates to a route. And you can also do dynamic routes. For example, you could create something of this nature, where a post ID would generate post/1, post/2 page, and this square bracket thing kind of defines that this is a dynamic page. But what is really interesting about Next.js is how they understand that a dynamic application, or an application that really needs to scale with a lot of data in it, they understand how data fetching would work there. They have these multiple options for generating your pages statically or from server side. So if you take a look at their documentation, get static props is the idea where you create this function and return all of its data in the props. For example, let's say if this is where you are going to list all of your blog posts. So you create a get static function, you fetch all of your posts, and you return this post data as props, which is then consumed by this UI, and this UI would build this map of all of your posts. And this is not something that would happen on the server side. It would happen when you will be building your site. It would happen in a way that your site that is built by your builder, that is Next.js, it would be a static website. And then you can also use get static paths. Let me show you what that is. So get static paths is also a function where you actually define the paths that are needed to be static. For example, you can return these two paths with IDs 1 and 2. And for a page, a dynamic page with this brackets ID kind of name, it would use this function along with the get static props function to bring in the API and produce these two pages, which would be called post 1 and post 2. So these two functions kind of go hand in hand. But what's really important here is in get static paths, you can actually define a fallback parameter where you can kind of say, for example, let's say you had only 2 pages, you see, but what if a person wanted to visit posts/3? How would that happen? So that would happen if you would have set fallback to true, and if you would handle it in a different way. Let me show you. Let me just quickly go over how that fallback page would work. For example, in get static paths, you have imagine that you have fetched this data from an API, which has the information for page 1 and the page number 2. But the user is going to visit page number 3. So since the data that existed in our static paths, or when the website was built by Next.js, it did not build the third page, what would happen is it would go to that fallback being true. It would use our server side, to create that page dynamically on the go. You see, you would use router.isFallback, and you would load that particular page right then and there when the a hit comes in, while your server is kind of producing that from your server side. And later on, you can go ahead and build this data. Once it's actually there, once the API is ready, it would be actually here. So your static side would have this statically generated page, and you wouldn't have to use fallback. I know what I just said is super confusing, but let me just summarize it a little bit. Imagine your API had just 2 pages, and the user went for the third page. Next.js data fetching would fetch that third page from your API using its server-side rendering, and the server would render that third page and give it to your user. And later on, your static site would generate that page statically. So for example, when that user comes back to this page, it actually exists as a static page, and the server is not used for that part. This is sort of what we call a hybrid JAMstack approach, a hybrid approach which allows you to scale your applications really well. You build something which is both static and dynamic, and dynamic only while it's needed to be dynamic, which becomes static later on. For example, to reduce the amount of time that is required to build my demo page in CloudyCam to 15 seconds, I would just use that dynamic page for that particular amount of time, while the actual builder behind the scene is building that page statically for the next 2 or 3 minutes. I hope you get this idea. It's pretty amazing how Next.js does this thing, and I definitely implore you to go ahead and check this out. Another example for this would be, imagine you're building a blog and you just want to quickly preview your post, how that draft post looks like. You don't really want to go ahead and build your entire website to be able to preview that blog. So with this fallback option, you can actually, and they actually have more options where you can actually build a preview in, where that preview would just ignore the static site builder and use the server-side rendering to build that preview on the server side using your server. Let's go back from the documentation here. So Next.js is what I settled with, and I'm still happy with it. It went out really good. CloudyCam has received about 500,000 page requests, and we've generated about 660 or something demo pages, and these demo pages are being generated in less than 15 seconds. And the entire experience is just really good. It has both static site and server-side rendering support. Plus minus progressive web app support, like everywhere, but I was able to easily build a progressive web app with Next.js. After all of these features, all of the requirements that I had behind the scenes, I pretty much believe that Next.js blows Gatsby.js out of its waters. Next.js is truly awesome on building dynamically generated and statically generated static sites with JAMstack, which is actually scalable. And for a better part of every JAMstack application that I've built, I've ended up needing some sort of scale in it. Okay, now coming back to the backend option. What I needed was a serverless setup. I didn't want to manage a server for a small, developer activation demo like this. And similarly, like when you have a server, but you don't have to manage it, we call it serverless. Imagine having a backend that you don't really have to manage. And I think this is what we would call backend-less approach, which is also known as infrastructure as code, where you just write a bunch of code and your server is kind of built for you. And you don't really have to manage that server. You just say, okay, I need my Go API, Go language API to be built. I need my Python language API to be built and Node.js API language to be built. And all of the infrastructure that is needed to do these kind of things is done for you based on your code, not something you end up managing on your own or orchestrating your service. And a good to have was a monorepo. So what is a monorepo? A monorepo is where you put all of your code in one repository. For example, in this JAMstack demo, we had this private developer activation thingy, which I couldn't distribute using an NPM package or whatnot. So I would just allow all of my team members to git clone this repository and start using it. This particular choice made it really easy because it was just one thing that they needed to do, but it kind of complicated the problem of building a monorepo. So what our repository had was all the API, all the backend stuff, all the front-end stuff, all the things related to documentation, all of it inside one single repo. So initially, I thought it would be good to have a backend, which would be backend-less and serverless, and I wouldn't have to kind of manage it, and it would have monorepo support. Okay, but one thing I was missing here was I still needed to use something to actually manage the developer. How would you go about creating a new demo? You'd probably need a CMS, but doing this with a CMS kind of slowed things down for us. For example, if you take your images, if you take the images from your photographer and try to upload them in your CMS and publish a new page, it generally takes about 30 to 35 seconds if you have like fast fingers and if everything is in sync. But what I had was a budget of 15 seconds. I wanted to build that demo page under 15 seconds. So when you are done getting your pictures taken, your demo page is ready as well. So instead of depending on a CMS, I ended up building a Node.js-based, CLI-based CMS. A CLI would do anything you want. For example, you would say your new demo page and it would create that demo page. Here are some of the demo commands that I can probably show you. For example, if you would create your new Awais, it would go ahead, fetch the images that were taken from the DSLR, let's say the last 3 images using our pool setup with Raspberry Pi and whatnot. And it would then use those images, resize them with the Node.js and JavaScript APIs, and kind of upload them to CloudRing. Then I'll get those images URLs hosted on a CDN with CloudRing, and I would create this JAMstack application demo page with Next.js through the CLI that would be hosted on cloudycam.dev/Awais. You see, these are a lot of steps, and I needed to be able to do these in less than 15 seconds. That is why I depended on building the CLI based on Node.js, where you just do your new Awais, and it takes these 3 images and do all of this and creates a cloudicam.dev Awais page for you. And you could also do fun stuff with it. For example, let's imagine having a demo with 2 people who got 2 pictures taken at the same time with 2 persons in one picture. So what would you do is you would just run the duplicate command and duplicate a particular demo page and create a new one. For example, this Awais demo page that we had created here would now also have another duplicate page called cloudicam.dev/Ahmad. It worked out really well building a Node.js CLI here. Now I needed something serverless, something backendless. And Zeit now is sort of a platform, which is, I would say, the parent company that helps support the development of Next.js. And it is a really cool, static hosting. It is something where you can actually use React.js, Vue.js, Node.js, even Go language-based APIs. It has almost no configuration support for monorepo, where you just build, you say, this is my API.go file, this is my API.py file for Python, this is my API.js file. It is going to be built using Node.js. And it would just go ahead and do that. And the serverless is, it also has the concept of serverless functions. Let me show you how. For example, for Next.js, in the pages directory, you create a directory called API. Every file in this particular directory of API becomes your actual API endpoint. For example, let's imagine having a file called getuser.ts for TypeScript. I forgot to mention that Next.js comes with a built-in support for TypeScript. And that is sort of where I kind of want to go from here, that Next.js kind of does everything for you. You don't need to manage React or Webpack or TypeScript support or support of these serverless functions in backend or whatnot. The performance is sort of really built in. You generate a React-based application, which is performant by default. The CSS is chunk-sized. You're only loading the CSS that is needed for your particular page. You're only loading the JavaScript required there. And then there's fallback support for your React application to become a sort of a single-page application when there's JavaScript support, and then fall back to a complete static site if you want it to be. And you coming back to this API point, imagine this page. You can just use now Node Builder in the request and response and respond to this as a JSON with the user data by using your database or whatnot. And this would just build, your API page using Node.js. And a user would be able to visit this endpoint by going through /API/get-user, which we actually build. And it would, this particular data would be returned to the user using JSON, the one we kind of just, I wouldn't have to manage anything here, nothing, no, nada, zip. File-based routing to create serverless functions of your API as well as endpoints. Come at me. I really like this thing. Whereas I believe they also have this thing called builds, which is sort of a bit deprecated in favor of functions. But I ended up using this to support my monorepo, where you can define a particular path and tell now to only use it or only generate it using the static site builder or the static site generator that they have. And then you can define other paths to be able to build using, Python or Go language or Node or whatever you want. So that is how I ended up choosing Zeit now. Excellent support for monorepo, for deploying any kind of React or JavaScript or Node or Go language application. And it would generate a preview or URLs for every branch, every pull request on the go, which would make it really easy for us to kind of test things when we were building it, when we were developing. Okay, the one last problem that I had to deal with was documentation. So as you are right now, I was also pretty much tired of spending so much time on a very small project, which was not something of a mainstream, just a demo that we do in front of our developer friends. So I didn't want to invest a lot of time in building the UI. I wanted something that would support documentation in Markdown, which would have a good documentation UI, but it would allow me to make it, it would be customizable. It would allow me to make some customizations. And a good to have in my mind was maybe if it had a built-in search support where I don't have to use any kind of SaaS or invest more money into it, that would be a lot of fun. I did a lot of research. I ended up with VuePress. It's a Vue-based static site documentation generator. A pretty amazing documentation it has. And just a prefix here, I'm not a Vue developer. I love React. I build things in React. And I use VuePress without ever having to use Vue at all. I know I could have used Vue if I want to, but it makes it really easy to use. VuePress makes it really easy to be used by anyone. You don't have to be a Vue.js developer to use VuePress. And then it builds your static site, your documentation, which is not really dependent on JavaScript. It kind of oozes out all of the HTML content which is very much appreciated by your search engine robots that would index your documentation, and you would start getting more and more organic traffic. It supports Markdown out of the box and really has a good search functionality built in. Let me show you how. For example, in Markdown support, you can do a lot of things. You can have, you could just write this to generate a table of content by installing these Markdown extensions from ViewPress documentation. And these custom containers thingies that I really like, for example, you would define a syntax like this, and it would generate this cool looking output for your text warnings and whatnot. And here, as I have already shown you, this is what my documentation looked like for CloudyCam. This is actually built with ViewPress. You see how cool it looks. I didn't have to build this UI, but I still ended up, customizing a lot of it. For example, this particular syntax color, you see, if you are using my Shades of Purple theme, you probably would have already guessed it, that my documentation uses my own Shades of Purple theme. Vue.js allows you to use Prism CSS, and I just put Prism CSS inside the configuration, and ViewPress just did everything for me. It also comes with really cool features like you can just go ahead and edit this page on GitHub, and it also kind of figures out when was this page last updated and what. Even without having my support, my manager went ahead and contributed a Markdown-based document on a wireless setup from camera to laptop without my support. And it just worked. You can see it, how cool it looks, and these battery power indicators, these steps and whatnot. It did really make a lot of sense. And then the search support, for example, if you are looking for the delete command, if you write del here and press enter, here you are. Inside the commands, there's the del command. So it really felt really well. If you have, if I want to use a documentation site that is statically built using JAMstack, you can probably build it with ViewPress and host it anywhere on Zeit, Netlify, even on Amazon with AWS Amplify. It's really cool that this ViewPress documentation site has worked it out and has received a lot of traffic as well. And that was pretty much it. I had actually built a JAMstack application, which kind of is a hybrid approach, has both static and dynamic components to it, and use monorepo with Zeit now to put it all together and produce this awesome developer activation. To this date, we have received about 500,000 users on this particular developer activation. We have built over 600 demo pages, and it still hasn't costed us a penny. It is that cheap, and the performance is just built in. We started ranking for the term of CloudyCam at the very top of Google. A lot of our pages are already indexed in the Google, and then our documentation is really appreciated both from my managers, both from my colleagues, and it just looks good. I definitely ask you to kind of implore this JAMstack idea beyond what the trend looks like, beyond what everyone seems to be doing, and really go out there and start building these hybrid applications which are performant by default, and where you end up with less security issues, less hosting costs, and kind of consider the developer experience as well as the operational experience. So you don't end up generating your entire website statically only when you added one single page, especially for pages that you are going to need really quickly, like I did. And that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, go ahead, tweet them out to me at Mr. Ahmad Awais. I'll make a best effort to reply to everyone. And I'm going to be sharing the link to these slides on my Twitter ID. Go ahead, follow me there, and I'll see you there. Bye.
All right. It seems we are a little bit frozen.
I can hear you all right.
Oh, you can hear me? It's just video then. Video on the streaming tool was a little bit frozen for a second. Now it's like everything just played all of a sudden, Yeah. Anyways, now we are going to have a quick Q&A session. So if anybody has any questions, I know I have a few about JAMstack and Ahmad's talk. Now is the time to make those, to have those questions. So I guess I'll start, right? So Ahmad, do you have something to recommend to us? Say I've never used JAMstack before, and I do have a personal project where I'm using Next right now. If I wanted to start working with JAMstack, is there maybe a tutorial or something that I can read up online to educate myself and maybe start using JAMstack?
Yeah, definitely. I think the documentation Next.js has is pretty good. And there are a couple other resources, folks in the community are building. There's a Next.js book out there somewhere. You can read that. But naturally, there's one thing that I would definitely recommend. There's this create next app, a CLI, and Next.js actually has a folder called examples inside their parent repository on GitHub. If you take a look at that examples repository, you can actually kind of find what you are trying to build in there. Like, I think there are hundreds of examples inside there, different projects built with Vercel and Next.js. So that would be my go-to if I'm going to be building a Next.js.
And this is there are several different flavors as well. If I understand it correctly, you're able to use JAMstack with whatever static site creator you can. Like, for example, there's Nux that can do that, Gatsby as well. All of those can be used, right?
Yeah, definitely. Like, there are pros and cons to all of these. Like, for example, like as I mentioned in my talk, whatever I end up building with JAMstack, I end up having the need to scale it. And JAMstack, on one hand, it scales really well. Like, it's dirt cheap to host. It's just static HTML websites.
You're basically using a CMS.
Yeah, exactly.
To serve your stuff.
As compared to that, but what happens is whenever you have to create a change in your site or whatever you're building with this JAMstack, it ends up being this havoc. For example, I last week I was working with a company with a huge migration towards Next.js and a JAMstack website, and they have like about 22,000 pages, and it takes about on Netlify it used to take about an hour and 45 minutes to build with Gatsby.js. And they kind of I was brought into the project to see if they could move from Gatsby to Next.js, and maybe see if that would reduce the time. And Next.js is sort of there's an RFC, request for community comments, out there in Next.js. They're building an incremental build kind of thing, but the most of the power right now comes from their hybrid nature, where Vercel, which is the new side, Vercel, what it can do is you can actually go ahead and build a static site. And right when your static site is missing a page, that hosting they provide, that hosting could actually re-render that page dynamically on the front end. So it kind of switches back from server side static side generation to client side hydration of a server side rendering. I know it's a mouthful, but definitely super interesting if you kind of go ahead and look at it. So create next app and Next.js examples.
This is interesting for people who are thinking about an architecture right now, because I know that server side rendering can be very expensive as well and very process intensive. So definitely using a static website. Yeah, you get some performance gains over there. But I think we have a question right now as well. Let's see. Let's see if we can put it on the screen. So when should we prefer JAMstack? For example, my site might have login and different content for different users. So in this kind of scenario, which stack should I choose? I'm not sure quite I follow, but maybe you.
Yeah, definitely. Like, it's a very common question out there. Like, people are kind of struggling to find out how they can migrate their existing stack to JAMstack. And I keep telling them that JAMstack is just an idea. You are going to be some of the pioneers in this thing where you actually move your complex stacks to JAMstack, and it's still going to be a complex journey. What JAMstack offers is a good front-end developer experience. And front-end developers can actually go ahead and build anything nowadays. They are sort of what we call full-stack developers now. So if your site has a login, you can probably get away with something like Auth0 or Userbase. Like, Userbase is what, $50 a year for unlimited amount of users, and Auth0 is this giant big SaaS that you can use. Even if you have your login system with your own CMS, you probably would have an API there that Next.js could consume. And for Next.js has these three things: client-side rendering, and server-side rendering, and static-side rendering. So on client side, you can actually handle all of this login system and authentication and authorization and everything. And once that happens, you can actually direct your users to some place which is either dynamic or static. For example, in your scenario, if you have different users contributing to your site, you probably would want to direct them to something which is a mix of one API that is receiving data and a page that is server-side rendered. So your server can actually send the data to whatever database or whatever way you're using your database.
Yeah.
And if there are pages like, let's say, your contact form or your about page, those are sort of marketing pages which seldom change. I would recommend that you mark those pages as SSD, where they are built on a build time aesthetically. So that is sort of what I call the hybrid approach to JAMstack. And I think Vercel plus Next.js is a very good combination for that.
Well, it's going to take me some time to get used to saying Vercel instead of Zeit. Yeah, I guess we can end with just one last question. This also is mine. It's more of a comment, I guess, because I just mentioned about server-side rendering and how it can be very performance intensive. There is one thing that server-side rendering gains over a static website. I have to mention, I guess the initial state, right? Because if you just create your pages as static pages, yes, you're going to get some visual stuff coming in, but as soon as the application hydrates, right, then you're going to be making requests to get data. Whereas if you have a server-side rendered application, you might get that initial state embedded in the document that you first loaded, right? So I guess that's one of the things that you would get with server-side rendering that you might miss a little bit when you're working with the static page.
Yeah, definitely. Like server-side is super important. Even if you are anything that you used to build in a single page application that was earlier on a client-side routing kind of thingy, you have to think about SSR now, server-side rendering. So what happens is when you mention hydrates, it's a definitely, we have this inside joke that SSR is as good as the hydration of its concept in your brain. So, so the moment you learn what is, the moment you learn what is hydration, you kind of go, whoa, okay, now I see why SSR or server-side rendered pages are better than client-side rendered pages for SEO or for a lot of things for initial state, as you mentioned.
Awesome. Well, Ahmad, we are very happy that we had you over here today. We hope to listen to you and hear you again sometime in the future. I know for sure I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Awesome. Enjoyed my time a lot. I'm Mr. Awais on Twitter. Let's continue chatting there. Bye.
There you go. All right. So on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Sid. Let me get him on the screen real quick.
Hello.
Hey, Sid. Welcome.
Hey, is this mic? Is this all right?
Oh yeah, your mic is very fancy and it's working perfectly. It's loud and clear.
Great.
So this, if I understand it correctly, I remember seeing your face at I think it was React Love, or I can't remember now which of the conference, but it was back in 2019. I think that's the first time I saw you. You were with us before already then.
Yeah, that was the React one. Yeah.
That's right. And so for those who are watching us today, and if you're not familiar with Sid, Sid is a developer at Code Sandbox. Before that, he also worked for Auth0. And today, he is going to be talking to us about design primitives for React developers. So I don't know, maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of more like what you're going to be talking about.
Sure. So this talk is mostly around like my exploration on trying to make good designs without being a designer. I've spent a lot of time trying to learn, but I'm just like really bad at it. And I've found ways to make design a little more accessible to me and hopefully like more people.
And sometimes that's the blocker for people. They're like, oh, I have all these amazing ideas that I want to put out there, but hey, I need help from a designer.
Exactly.
Or how do I get those things done? So yeah, excited to hear from you. So without any more delays, let's give you the full time. I think you're probably going to share your screen, right?
Yeah.
There it is, screen. Yep, I think we can see it. There you go. The time is yours, Sid.
Sweet. I'm gonna mute this tab so that I don't hear myself back. Okay, perfect. There we go. As soon as I find my cursor. Amazing. So, hey everyone, I'm Sid. As mentioned, I'm a developer at Code Sandbox, and all of the notes for this slides are in this URL below, which is sid.st/primitives. So I mentioned a bunch of tools and resources. You can find them there. Cool. So I'm a developer, but I really, really like design. The interesting part is this: me liking design does not translate to me being good at design. I'm just not good. And I've tried to like learn over the times, but here's like a quick video of what my process is, and I'm gonna like walk you through it. So I usually start with like just the HTML, and I pop out all the HTML. I'm trying to make like a booking, like a vacation booking website here. And so you start with the HTML, it's all unstyled, you put all the labels, and then comes the difficult part, which is writing the CSS for it. And if you're like me, you probably start by adding some space, trying a few things out, and then you have to style the input and button, which look pretty ugly by default. And then what you do is you try things and you open developer tools, and then you're kind of tweaking that. Is 5 pixel good enough? Maybe it's 4, maybe it's 3. So you just like hit and try a few things, see what looks okay, and of course override some of the browser defaults, because that's something we have to do. And then pick that gray through the color picker, and when you think you've got something, copy it, paste it back in the editor, continue the whole story for other things, right? Design the button. Again, I wanted that Airbnb pink, so I kind of went into the editor, rolled it out, and then this whole page kind of looks out of place. I put it in a card, and a card essentially needs to be white. So I thought I'll give it a background, that hipster, slightly blue color that's trending these days. I try to give it that. Still looks ugly. Try to mess with padding until it looks decent, and then copy that thing up, put it back in the editor, right? And this is basically my process, right? So if you can relate to my process, throw me like an F in the chat. And this is what it looks like, right? It doesn't look ugly, but this doesn't look like a website that you would put your credit card in to book a vacation, right? It looks pretty primitive. So that's what my process was, right? So then to get better at design, I decided, okay, I'm going to read all the theory, right? I'm going to try to be a designer. So I read things about colors, how RGB exists, and how CMYK, and how CMYK is good for one thing, but RGB for the other. I looked at like color theories and how there's a color wheel, and you can use complementary color at the opposite ends, or triadic colors, which are like make a triangle. So for example, this logo uses complementary colors, and it looks pretty good. I got to know Burger King uses the 3 triangles of this, like the triadic colors. So this is useful, right? This would make a lot of sense. Learned about serif fonts and sans serif, and learned when to use them. So Uber, when they did a rebrand to look more friendly, they chose like a very sans serif and a curly font. Whereas the New York Times uses a proper serif font, like even like a stylish serif font to look, to look like newspaper and press and authoritative in that sense. So all of that theory helped, but I still don't know what to do when I start with this, right? Like I knew the color theory and triangles, but it didn't really help me design interfaces, because I felt like there's a lot of information still lacking. And it kind of, I look at other places, how they're doing to try to, copy, get inspired. And this is what Google Flights looks like. So, and this is what Airbnb looks like, the one I was trying to imitate. And you can see like, look at this and look at this, right? This is the developer you're like not supposed to be afraid of. So even they're using the same grays, they have a few spacing, but it almost felt like even if you have the same building blocks, you can't get to the same results. And it kind of just made me feel like I'm just not like a very good designer. That's what it comes back to, right? Like some people just get it. Some people are just inherently good at design, right? They, designers put on their sticky notes and look all smug. So I just thought that's just not me. I don't have the skills. Until about 2.5 years ago, I started working at Auth0 in the design system team. That is kind of where, oh no, I messed up the thing. So that is kind of where I learned how design doesn't have to be, design is not art. Like there is creativity and there is a lot of taste that comes into it. But a lot of design is actually about science. So I learned about modular scales, and this is kind of my understanding of the theories. So this quote is by Tim Brown, which I think makes a lot of sense. he said, by using culturally relevant, historically pleasing ratios to create scales and basing the measurements in our compositions and our values from those scales, we can achieve a visual harmony. So basically what he's trying to say is that instead of going to the color picker and trying to pick something, if you define your ratios and scales up front and pick values from that, you can actually create visually pleasing and harmonious designs. So let's talk about these three things first. Let's talk about typography, color, and space, and what I've discovered in them. So here's typography, right? You put a 16 pixel base font, and to get like a larger value, you multiply it by 1.125. So this is one of those modular scales. This one's called major second scale. They all have names. And you keep doing that, keep multiplying by 1.1.25, and then you get this scale, right? You divide it, so you kind of get this whole scale of values of font sizes. And there are a bunch of them. So all of these are based on some research. I use the major scale, but there's like minor second, minor third. Some of these are based on music, like octaves. But some of these are also, like you see, the golden ratio is also here. And you typically want like a smaller ratio if you're building in an application which has cramped space, right? The font sizes are pretty close by. But if you're building a blog site or a news site where everything has more space, the fonts are bigger, then you might want to use one of the bigger ratios, like maybe 1.5 or 1.33. So anywho, I picked major second, and this is my scale. Now comes the next part, like how do you represent this scale as inside your application, inside components, right? So I use React, and this is kind of an exploration of all of the ideas. So I've put it on GitHub. If you're interested, you can check that part out. And so the project I'm working on, React UI, is kind of built on these three, like standing on the shoulder of giants of the style systems, theme specification, style system, and emotion. So this is what the style UI theme specification recommends. You say, create a JavaScript object of tokens, and then you can put your font sizes. So I've taken basically my font scale from the previous slide, put it here, and given them indexes, right? So the first one is 11, then the next one is multiplied by 1.25, so I get 12.5, and these are rounded so that you can get good round numbers for the web. And then what I've done in React UI is when you say text, the text component kind of understands the font scale. So when you say size 4, you get 16 pixels. And that kind of really creates like a good design primitive for you. So if example on the left, we have like an apartment listing. It's like a holiday vacation listing kind of a thing. And right now, all of these are text size 4. They look the same, but we want to create some level of hierarchy. So what I would traditionally do is right click inspect, try to make the font size of entire, like the first label a little smaller until it kind of looks nice. But what I do now is instead of size 4, I say, let's bump it one level down. This is size 3 now. It looks good. Maybe we need more hierarchy. So let's bump it another size, and I go to size 2, right? So that now I'm not trying to pick from like the universe. I'm trying to pick for my scale, and all the only control I have is if I need bigger, then I go from 4 to 5, 5 to 6. If I need smaller, I go from 4 to 3, 3 to 2. Similarly, the euro price, the 76 a night, that's also secondary information. The main information, I guess, is the stunning city, the label. So I'm gonna reduce that to 3, right? And then just for a good touch, I made the euro price bold because that's something people want to look at. So then if you look at this comparison, if you look at the difference between the two, it's not amazing, but the difference is just enough to make it look designed. And the interesting thing here is I'm not thinking about font sizes or colors or any of that. What I'm thinking about is hierarchy. What I'm thinking about is the logic behind all of these 3 values, which is the main one, which is a secondary value, and then change the sizes for the secondary values. Let's talk about, so the same thing can be done for colors. You can put all your colors on a scale, and then you can go up and down. The weird part about like, we can't do the same mathematical thing with colors, because colors are slightly weird. I still don't understand why they're so weird, but increasing the quantity of the, like, if you decrease the brightness, it doesn't go linearly. Like every color is different. So this is a slide I took from Diana Mounter, who works at GitHub. And if you look at the notes on the link I shared, there's a great talk about color that she gave. And so if you look at this graph, this is different hues at 100% saturation, 50% lightness. And you can see they all have different luminosity. So you're mathematically trying to put them at the same level, but some colors are just brighter. So you see yellow always looks lighter, and blue always goes dark fast. So even though they're at 50% mathematical value, the perceived value of each one of them is different. And that is what makes colors slightly difficult to work with. There is research out there though. So there's also somebody has a formula. I'm skipping the name, but it's there in Diana's talk. The perceived, so what we want to optimize for is perceived brightness, not mathematical brightness when it comes to color. So there is a formula. If you have RGB, you can actually calculate it. And this color scale is taken from Steve Sugar, where he, instead of just using lightness, he also rotates the hue in order to make make a good palette. Because yet, if you look at yellow when you make it darker, just becomes like an ugly grayish yellow. Instead, you kind of want it to fade into orange, into brown. So you have to rotate the hue as well. So there is again research, luckily, around this, how to procedurally generate color with perceived brightness and darkness. And again, the Diana's talk has a lot more about it. So luckily for the rest of us who don't want to get into color theory, there are tools. So this is one of them. It's called Palex. And what I've done is I've taken my pink color that I wanted for the hotel site. I've put it there, and it generates it not only generates the pink scale, it also generates a bunch of complementary scales. So it has a warm gray for me, a teal, a cyan, a bunch more, so that I can use this for my entire application. Another one I really like is Scale. With Scale by Hayek, you can also change how many colors you want. So what I've learned is that if you put the middle color, and how do you even choose the middle color? So I choose the middle color by putting, what would I put in the button, right? So this is my primary button, that's the middle color, and I pick the middle color just dark enough so that I get an accessible button. So I have a double A accessibility on this one. And then you say, I want 4 darker colors, 5 lighter colors, and you can actually tweak how much saturation do you want, how much lightness you want. And the trick that I always use is, if I use the lightest color as the background, can I put the darkest color as text and get an accessible output? So for example, in this case, I wanted to make like a warning alert. And so I'm using the lightest color as the background of it, and still I get like a AAA accessibility. So that means this is good. And then you still get a bunch of shades in between for borders, hover states, that kind of thing. So that's kind of my trick around it. You don't have to generate your own colors if you don't want to. There are a bunch of open source color scales that you can just use. So for example, there's this one, open color. There is the material UI colors. There's Tailwind colors. Again, all of the links are in the link, in the /primitives link that I shared. And this is kind of how React UI adopts it. So if you give it a list of colors as tokens, so I've given pinks, and then I'm trying to follow the convention that Material UI follows here, where they say 100, 200, 300. You can also say 1, 2, 3, 4. It doesn't matter. The convention I like is that 100 is the lightest, 900 is the darkest, and you go on a scale. And in the text component, you can say color pinks 500, and it reads from your tokens and then gets the right color. After you define all of them, you can also do a bunch of decisions in the theming layer. And this is something that comes back to like building design primitives for us, which is in my text component, I define these variants where I say the default or the body one is gray 900, which is the darkest. And if I want a subtle gray, then I say its gray is 700 and my error state is this. So now in my text component, I can say text variant is subtle or variant is error, and that picks the right color. So going back to our previous example, let me zoom that a little. The entire apartment that you see, so size is a great way to create this hierarchy. If you add size with color, that's even more perfect. So when I add variant subtle, then you kind of get this slightly more grayer touch, and you kind of start seeing this. It's starting to come around. It looks like somebody designed this and not a developer, and that's kind of the trick. Let's talk about space. So space is probably the one of the most important constraint that I learned. So on the left, you see there is this interface which has no clear rhythm. You have 24, 20 different sizes, different spacing, and the mockup on the right uses a 8-point scale. So what that means is that every element, the height of it has to be a multiple of 8, and the space between it is also has to be a multiple of 8, right? So this is just using a grid system, which probably a lot of you are familiar with. Like this is another example where you're using a 8 multiple of 8. So the gap between email address and the input is 8 pixels, and the gap between the two inputs is 16, which is a multiple of 8. So another way to say this is that the gap between label and input is 1 unit. The gap between the two inputs is 2 units, where 1 unit is just 8 pixels. And then the height is always 5 units, which is 40. So this is kind of a really cool thing. So you can use you can use units of 8, or you can use units of 4, which I usually prefer units of 4 because again, the application use case is kind of like you have a lot of information cramped, so you need smaller units. But if you're designing a blog, then you might benefit from the bigger scale, which is 8 pixels. Represented in React UI, put it in the tokens. I kind of define them as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I like that nomenclature. And in my head, what I do is I always remember that I have to multiply by 4. So when I say 1 unit, it's actually 4 pixels. When I say 2 units, it's 8 pixels. When I say 5, it's 5 into 4, 20. So I'm always thinking like 5 units of space. And it's wise if you change these from pixels to rem so that you get the accessible font scale feature as well. So components in React UI understand the scale. So when you attach margin bottom to a component and it's there in all components, it understands that when you say 4, you're actually saying 4 units, which is 16 pixels. And similarly, there's a stack which has a gap so that you can put two things together and put a gap in between. That also understands the scale. What else can you essentially systematize? So this is from Material UI, like a really good blog post. Link is here, and in the primitives resource, they have a really good resource on how fast should animations be, right? So for example, they have this open card, which opens in 300 milliseconds. Let me play it back for you. Opens at 300 milliseconds, but closes in 250. So that's an interesting thing where exit animation should be faster. Then there's this one, again, opens, closes, opens in 250, closes in 200. So it's always the exit is supposed to be faster. Let me play that back. You can see exit is slightly faster. And then there are components like the switch, which should always be super fast. So the switch is, okay, let me quickly reach there. Nice. So the switch you see is always instant. There's no wait. It's always 100 milliseconds. But all of these are still from a definite set of constraints, right? You go from the smallest you can have is 50 milliseconds, and the biggest they have is 300 milliseconds. And if you put them on a scale, you kind of get these options. Again, like the components understand the scale. So when you say transition duration, you can say 4, which translates to 200 milliseconds. And if it feels too fast, then you can slow it down. You can say, okay, let's use transition duration 5, which bumps to the next level on the scale, 250 milliseconds. So again, it kind of removes the art angle of it, like trying to find the perfect thing, because you're only moving from one value on the scale to the next value on the scale. So the constraints actually help you design faster. So this is a video after incorporating all the things I just told you, and I'm gonna say what's happening. So I'm using a heading and I'm using the margin bottom, you can see, and then I wrap it in a form. React has a form field, which helps you with the label. Now I'm using the input and buttons, and you can all see like the inputs are actually really big. And I'm going to slow this down. This is too fast. Whoop. Let's go back. Okay. So what's interesting here is that the inputs and buttons are exactly the same size. And the form also adds a gap here inside, which is consistent. And just the consistency of space makes a really good API and makes it really look pretty. So this is me adding a form label. And you can see I struggled with what should be the size of the label here. So I tried form size 3. It looks small. I made it 4. It looked good to me. And then I wanted to capitalize it. So I did the text transform uppercase, but now it looked really big. So I went back and made font size 3. So earlier, what I would do is right click, DevTools, up, like 16, 16.5, 17, 17.5 until it looks good. But now I just do font size 3, font size 4. And I know I'm on a scale where the gap is big enough to create hierarchy between two values. Sorry, moving on. So there's a stack. I wanted to put it on the right. And the check-in and checkout is another thing that I wanted them to look together. So I did that. And then you can see me again struggle with the gap. So the check-in, checkout are stacked horizontally. Oh, come on, I keep doing that. Yeah, the check-in, checkout are stacked horizontally. So I was like, okay, let me give a gap. I tried gap 2, too small. Tried gap 4, too big. So I came back to gap 2. Felt enough. Similar to the previous example, I decided to put it in a card and then struggled with the size, ended up picking something which is divisible by my theme. And this is what the theme actually looks like. When you put all the space and font weights and font sizes, everything on a scale, this is kind of what it looks like. It's a bunch of values. I copied the pinks from the previous slide over here so that I can use it in my button. And you can see when I scroll down, these are my button variants. So I have a primary, that's where I use the 700. And then I wanted something darker on hover. So I used 800. And then when you focus on it, I wanted something light. The last thing left to do is just put a nice background in the background, nice picture in the background. So I went to Unsplash, found some images, and this is what the end result is. So you can already see like this kind of looks really good. It's still not like Airbnb level, but it looks like somebody designed it, right? It looks a lot more intentional. And when you put like my previous effort and my new effort, you can see that one of these is something you might put your credit card information, but the one on the right looks shady, looks suspicious. So even if you remove the background, I think just when you're playing with enough color difference and enough space, that is kind of what the core difference between these two UI is. Like that enough makes a big difference. So I hope that's helpful. I've put if you want to check out React UI, which is the design primitives inside in this talk, you can check it out on this URL, and it's on GitHub. It's open source. And if you want the resources, all the articles I mentioned in this blog, in this talk, I put them in this one page, sid.st/primitives, and that's my Twitter handle if you want, if you like what you hear. Thank you. Hey, that went really fast, didn't it? Oop, then you're stuck.
Yeah.
Hey, yeah, now I think I can hear you. No. Can't hear you, Ben.
How about now?
Yes. Now
Okay.
you have. Yep.
Yeah, I'm actually running out of memory here because I have so many tabs on my Chrome right now, and I figure that's why things are just going in slow motion. Yeah.
Yeah.
But cool that I'm not frozen anymore. This was very interesting because you can make a very professional looking website if you just follow some simple design principles. And you mentioned Material UI, and that's actually how I pull off a lot of those things as well. Like with the theme generation tool, I basically select one color and then it generates all the colors for me. Also with the spacing, it's very nice actually. So I really enjoyed your talk. Let's see if we have some questions as well from the people who have been watching. But in the meantime, I meant to ask you about Material UI itself. I mean, do you use Material UI as well?
Nope.
Nope, because you're using React UI. But I mean, any reasons why you don't use it?
Not really. So I think it's a really good resource, and it's really good. The only challenge I face is it's written for Android, is what I feel. Like it matches a lot of the defaults are built for Android, and if you're making PWAs for mobile, I think it's a really good library. A lot of work I do is for the bigger screen on web, and that's why I feel like there is more creativity, or there is more things that I can do on the web, and which doesn't have to match Google's guidelines.
And it's funny because even if you're doing a mobile first approach, the look and feel of a web application is quite a bit different than a native application, especially when you look at Google's design system. But yeah, cool. I mean, I have to stop using a little bit of Material UI and start doing things manually as well, so I can get used to those principles. But I've been in a lot of projects before where it's just mayhem with the colors. Every time you're doing something new, you have to add new colors to your styles, and then you lose completely the control over consistency in your website.
Yep.
Yeah. After a while, thing that we have today.
Yep. After a while, you just add, like, you go to the bottom of the CSS file and you add stuff there, because like you just stop changing things because you don't know what will break if you change a color.
Yeah. One question: what's your tool? You mentioned a couple of different tools in your talk. What's your tool of choice when it comes to checking your accessibility and your usability in your website? Because I know that depending on the colors that I choose, maybe I have a very nice palette, but I don't know if there's going to be a contrast issue, for example, if I, depending on the colors that I choose. Do you have a tool that you usually use to check that?
Yeah. So if I already have a color in my project, then I just use Chrome's the inspect thingy, because Chrome already tells you. But if I'm still building my colors, then I use this tool called Colorable, which is by Brent Jackson. So I think it's colorable.Jackson Black. It's a hard thing to pronounce, but if you search for Colorable, you'll find it.
Colorable. So I'm gonna look that up later. Okay, just checking if there are any questions. I don't think we have any questions from our attendees right now, but I wanted to thank you again because your talk was very insightful. I have been looking for some of that information myself. Oh, by the way, there you go, Robbie. Let's see. Any resources to learn React apart from the docs? Oh, I guess we can go to the React website for that one. So we'll skip this question unless you feel inclined to answer this one, Sid.
Sure, yeah. I'll just plug egghead.io. There are a bunch of really good courses there. A bunch of my friends make videos there. Yeah, check out. Yeah. It's pretty cool.
I use Udemy myself, so also like those. Oh, by the way, do you have any courses that you do, or are you just mainly doing talks lately?
Sorry, you'll have to repeat the question.
Yeah, so I mean, do you also teach as well? Like, do you do courses as well, or only talks that you have been doing lately?
I've done some in the past, but right now I don't have any courses running.
Okay, all right. So I guess we can close with one last question from Jonas. Can you recommend any resources similar to Tailwind UI?
Depends. If you're a React developer, I'll recommend check out React UI and check out Theme UI. Theme UI and React UI actually share a lot of ideas. I think the direction Theme UI kind of started or pioneered. I think there's a lot of interesting work happening there.
Yeah, I think React UI also gives you a lot of freedom as well, right? So you can go away from the whole design system from Google. Okay, we have some comments as well. Francis, I like you, I like design, but I am by no means a designer. I do try to be aware of it. I guess that's how we all try to be because we are developers. But anyways, Sid, it was a pleasure to have you with us today. I hope to have you again in the future as well. It's always nice to have you here. Yeah, thank you for spending the time to prepare this awesome talk for us. Very insightful, very informative. Very happy to have you, man.
Sure, yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so on to our next speaker. I hope she's ready. Her name is Marjorie Figueroa. So let's see if I can put her up on the screen. I think her, there you go. Your webcam is on now.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Welcome, Marjorie.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Marjorie, I think she's based in Germany right now. She works for Zooplus AG as a front-end developer. And I think before that you were in Venezuela, right?
Yeah, I come from Venezuela.
Nice. That's cool. I come from Brazil, so I guess we're South American brothers. Yeah, so we are very happy to have you here today. Today, Marjorie is going to be talking to us. Wait a minute, let me open here. Okay, she's going to be talking to us about accessibility, which is a very important subject. In fact, this week, there was a very important discussion on, I think it was Hacker News, about accessibility and about blind developers. I have, this subject is actually very personal to me because I've had a couple of colleagues who are blind, so very excited to hear your talk today. So I don't know, maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview as well before we go in.
Yeah, so this talk is not very technical. I try to go into more of the concept of why and why do we need it, and some very from the surface issues that are found everywhere and that are found a lot out there, and things that we can do in order to improve it, and how can, like, who benefits from all of these things.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm gonna give you the time then. I don't know if you maybe you want to share your screen so I can put it up. It should be right at the bottom of the rest of the control. There you go. I see it.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I think it's live now, and the time is yours, Marjorie. Thank you.
Thank you. So this link that you see here is the link to the slides in case that you want to follow along by yourself. And yeah, so the name of my talk is Accessibility, What, Why, and How. And before starting to go into what accessibility is and all of these concepts, I want to dedicate a bit of time to disabilities and the word itself. So disabilities is an umbrella term. An umbrella term is a word or a phrase that covers a wide range of concepts. And an example of this is birds. Birds includes different types of birds, like hummingbirds, parrots, penguins, etc. In my case, when I hear the word birds, I think about parrots because there are a lot of them in my country. And the problem with these kind of terms is on the way that our brain works. So we tend to abstract and generalize concepts depending on our experiences. And this might not be such an issue when talking about animals and objects, but when we talk about people, social topics, genders, or rights, it can get problematic. And this, I believe, is what happens with the word disabilities. When I say this word, each of you might think on something different, but many of us might also think about the same thing. And this could be someone in a wheelchair or a blind person. It depends. The interpretation of this word will be different from person to person. And that's why establishing one definition for this is kind of problematic. So when we go to the dictionary, we can see that it says that a disability is an illness, injury, or condition that makes it difficult for someone to do the things that other people do. And what are these things that other people do, right? These interpretations or these definitions relies on the interpretation of what a normal activity is. And something that might be considered normal in one society might not be in another one. And it also tends to be associated with an illness, a health issue, when in reality is really much more than that. So when we see or go to the World Health Organization, they tell us that disabilities can include impairments, which is a problem in a person's body function or structure, a participation restriction, which is the involvement on life situations, and activity limitations, which is difficulty encountered when executing an activity or an action. As we can see, this word has a lot of different interpretations and covers a lot of different concepts, because disabilities vary a lot. They can be temporal, they can be permanent, they can be related to our bodies, or they can be related to environments. So when they're more related to our environments, we can see them as a mismatch between a person's abilities and their environment. So the way that I interact with the world or with the things around me is very different from the way that you do it. And when we create inaccessible environments, we are therefore creating disabilities. And this is where the concept of accessibility comes into place, what I call the what. And again, if we go by definition, accessibility is the ability to access. Breaking down the word, we have access and this particle et, which give us this ability. And the principle of accessibility is to eliminate or reduce barriers that hinder the rights of people with disabilities. And this is no matter if it's about spaces, things, or information. Anything that we do should be able to be accessed by everyone. And when we apply these concepts, or when we apply this definition into the web or applications or everything that we do into our world, we can say that being accessible is about making your website available for anyone, no matter how they have to use it. So here I'm paraphrasing a bit Kate Cunningham from the Accessibility Handbook, and this is also going a bit more into universal design. What I like about this definition is that it's not putting a subject, it's not putting a certain group of people or a minority into it. It's just everyone, right? Everyone needs to access the things that we do, and everyone has to use them no matter what or how they use it. And then we come to why. So for this that I already said, you might have an idea why do we need it. But if you ask me, I will say because it's the right thing to do. But this is not enough, right? If it would be enough, I wouldn't be here talking to you. The world that we live will be in a better shape. And why is this happening, right? What are all these things that doesn't make us think about accessibility? And I believe that one of the reasons is that the world we live is in a constant state of change. So everything is changing very, very fast. We came from having computers that fit in a whole room into being able to wear them in our arms. And this happened in a relatively short amount of time. Everything changed. The interaction with computers and the interaction with technology changed a lot and drastically. And also websites. Websites came from being like this, just text and links, very simple, into things like this, pop-ups, banners, consents, cookies, everything, images, videos, etc. So technology has changed. The web has evolved. And by now, the web is part of our everyday life. If you want to apply for a job, you do it online. If you want to do your taxes, also maybe you can do it online. Learning new things, online shopping, everything. And now in this situation that we are, where we need to stay home, we are realizing the importance of the online world, of the web, because everything is being done online, learning, teaching, etc. And I believe that we successfully managed to increase the reach of technology, the internet, but we also successfully managed to make it confusing, inaccessible, and not really welcoming for everyone, which is a bit sad, or very sad, I will say. And in 2019, the Web Accessibility in Mind, in short, WebAIM, is a nonprofit organization which provides accessibility solutions for a very long time, I think 1999. And they conducted an accessibility evaluation. They took the top 1 million homepages and they processed them with a tool called Wave. So what this tool does is detects patterns in the websites that doesn't align or do with the accessibility standards or with the web content accessibility standards. And the thing with these tools, this is not the only one, there are multiple ones, is that they're limited. The detection or the amount of issues that they can detect is around 25%. So all of the other issues might need manual review or so on, but 25% is also a lot. And with this, running this web, 1 million websites of the top home pages, they found this amount of errors. So this is a lot. This is more than 59 million errors. an average of 59.6 errors per page. And they also found that 97.8% of the analyzed websites contain errors. And these top million websites include things like Instagram, Facebook, Washington Post, Reuters, Stanford, and Berkeley University. And if you think about it, this is kind of great because these are social media sites, news sites, university sites. These are things that should be available for everyone, and they're not. Or if they are, they might be very difficult to use. And why is this happening? So the same thing that happens with the language of when we interpret things depending on our own experiences, our own cultures, our own language, then I believe this also happens with the things that we create. So when we're not exposed to the different ways that something can be used or the different ways that something can be experienced, then we don't enrich our products with this. And that is why I believe accessibility is often forgotten or disregarded. It's left at the end, like waiting for someone to complain, waiting for some customer not being able to use your online shopping, for example, or waiting for some developer to read, hear about it, and work on it. So in many cases, this is something that it's done at the end. One, it's something that it should be done from the beginning. So how do we do this? There are many things that we can do. And I think that we all have a role to play in here. So whether you're a designer, a developer, a tester, business person, everything, all of them, none of them, something different. If you have something, if you put content out there, if you have your hands into doing something that is put out there and is exposed to people, then you have something to do and to contribute with accessibility. So what I want to do is go through some of the topics that this evaluation touched and see what is affecting, which people are benefiting from when we fix this. And yeah, so my first advice will be go back to the basics. So every day there are new things coming, frameworks, technologies, things that we can play with, and we tend to forget the basics. And this happens a lot with HTML. So when we do our HTML, we should make sure that it's semantic and that it's a structure, because when we make our HTML semantic and structure, we are providing context into what is in there. And I like to see this as using the right tag in the right place. So we have all of these different tags in HTML. We have divs, buttons, headlines, articles, aside, etc., a bunch of them. And all of them have their own meaning, and they have a native behavior. So some assistive technologies use what is called the accessibility tree. In this case, the browser will take the DOM and will modify it into a form that will be useful for these technologies. It might have less information, less nodes, because some elements are only visual, and so on. So we can say that the accessibility tree is kind of a subset of the DOM tree. And this can be done because the DOM has a semantic meaning. It uses HTML. Native HTML elements work well because we know that the behavior is established, is predictable. And when we use an anchor tag, it knows it's a link. And when we write HTML, we should make sure that we use what is provided, because in many, many cases is enough. So a very common example out there is this comparison between divs and buttons. So when we use a div to make a button, and we go check what does the browser know about this. So let's say we have a div, it's a button which is primary, and then we can see that the browser knows nothing about this. It doesn't have any name, it doesn't have any role. It might not be even focusable because you will need to add a tab index to it in order to make this. But if we use a button, then the browser knows. It knows what it is, it knows what it does. It has a name, in this case primary, and it knows that it's a button, and it knows it can be focusable. So there's a lot of information there. And then it will be able to communicate to the user that uses, for example, a screen reader. So in this case, it's our job to use the proper tags. And if you're creating a state-of-the-art component where no other element will fit, then do so. There's no problem on that. But you need to keep in mind that you need to make sure that it's accessible, and you need to provide the right roles and behaviors for it. If you are making this very shiny stuff, then make sure that it's accessible with the keyword, that you are providing keyword behavior along with the mouse behavior and so on. And on the structure part of the HTML, then here comes in play things like headings. And in the evaluation that this web AAM did, they found that 36.3 of all of the pages skipped headings. So you may say, what's heading skipping? So we have all of these heading levels, go from 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So sometimes we tend to skip this heading. So jump maybe from the 1 to the 3, or start in the 3 and go to the 5, or go to the 1. So they're in the wrong order. Ideally, this should have like a natural order. So every page should have a H1, and then continue H2, H3, and so on. This is, in many cases, the main entry point for someone that uses an assistive technology. For example, with VoiceOver on Mac and Safari, you can bring up the menu, a menu that will list you all of the headers of the page, and you can navigate your website like this. So this is what some users use for navigating our pages. And when this doesn't have any right order, it might get very confusing. And same happens with tab index and the order of elements. So in tab index, we see a lot that we start playing with it and start putting positive values on it, and then we start altering the order of the page. So when we do this, then we can see maybe our focus moving from the top to the bottom to the middle and so on. So this is should not be encouraged. Putting positive values inside the tab index attribute. Ideally, if you need something, you should either make it 0 to make your element focusable, or -1 to make it focusable with scripts, or take away the focus. So there's some logic to go into this attribute. And the same happens with the order of elements. So we can have a right order in our HTML, but then with CSS, we can take elements out of the natural order. And maybe this button, which comes second on our structure, then it's at the end in the visual way of structuring the page. And this also might cause confusion, because then you will see that something comes from, you listen that this comes first, but it's actually at the end of the thing. So it can cause a lot of confusion. So when we do this, when we have our HTML structure right, and it's very semantic, then we're helping everyone that uses assistive technologies, for example, screen readers. Another very common issue out there is alternative text. So in this evaluation, there were around more than 36 million images, and 36.7, this is an average of 36.7 images per homepage, and 33.6% of these images didn't have any alternative text at all. And 16% had an alt text, but it was kind of questionable, or didn't have it. So it's kind of weird the way that people are using this. Some people also use them for SEO and just put random words on it, which is also not a good practice. But the thing is that writing alternative text is not really straightforward. We need to take care of certain things, right? We need to provide the right context while still describing the image. So in the example that we have here, we can say that an alternative text for this image could be brown dog reading, or it could be a dog trying to find who's a good boy. You don't know. It depends on the context. And maybe it's just a decorative image. And in this case, there's no need to put an alternative text. The attribute should still be there, but it should be empty for decorative images. So we can say, as a rule of thumb, that every image needs an alternative attribute, but some of them might not need any text. And with this, also, we have the topic of focus, which when we refer to focus, this determines where the keyword events go in the page at any given moment. And some elements are focusable by default, like inputs and buttons, but others are not, like divs or spans. So another rule of thumb here is if it's interactive, it needs a focus state. And sometimes we tend to remove this outline that comes. So the natural focus state of elements is an input, and it looks like this, like a blue outline. And this tends to be removed because it's ugly, it doesn't go with the designs and so on. But when we remove it, we should provide an alternative, because the element is still focusable, but there's no visible indication for keyboard users, for example. And also, sometimes leaving it up to the browser is not just enough, because let's say you have a blue background color, then the outline is not visible. So you need to take this in account. Luckily, we can style this with CSS. So you have the outline property, which accepts color, style, width, offset. And with this configuration, you will have something like this, like a reddish outline, a dashed outline. And what is great about this particular one, I will say, is the offset, because in this case, it doesn't blend with the border. When it doesn't have an offset, then the outline might blend with the border, and then you need to take into account that too. And what is important here too is the color. So color and contrast. When building our products with diversity and accessibility in mind, color choice is very important. Color can convey from your brand and your brand identity, and can also help users understand certain information, right? But the thing is that not everyone perceives color the same way. There are people with visual disabilities, and they should also perceive the content on the page, and also depends on the environment that you are. So here I have an image with a bunch of different colors, and when we apply a filter that simulates the color blindness of the lack of green, it looks like this. So it's very dull. Colors might change. In other type of color blindness, this might look completely different. So, for example, when we have a graph on our pages and it's a color-coded graph, then we should also provide an alternative to this, because only relying on color, it's not really enough. For example, Trello does a very good job on this. So they have this colorblind friendly mode, and this adds just a texture overlay on top of the color. And in this way, users can identify the different things without having to rely only on color. So who benefits from this? I would say users with partial sight, which have limited color vision, older users also who doesn't see color very well, maybe someone using a text-only browser or a limited color or monochrome display also benefits, and users like color blindness who have different difficulty distinguishing between different colors. So as we can see, just adding a small pattern on top of this queue, it's helping a lot of people. In the case, for example, of a form, if you have an error state, then maybe you should, instead of just making the border red, accompany with some text, some icons, something that gives like more information into this. And on the side of the contrast, then this is more of the difference between of the background and the foreground colors. So the text and the background usually. And in this case, we have an example of the New York Times. And when we apply a filter that simulates low contrast sensitivity, it looks like this. So this is the low contrast sensitivity is very common in older people. And as we can see, it's very hard to read this text under the images. And if this is the color of the article, and it's a bunch of words and paragraph, then it's very hard to read. And this will also affect, for example, someone that is reading in different lighting conditions, such as sunlight or glare. So in general, content should be easier to read for everyone, including those who doesn't have any specific visual conditions. And on the same topic of content, we have text. So with text, not everyone reads at the same level or has the same ability to understand text content, even when we present it clearly or simple. So we have reading disorders, memory disorders, attention deficit disorders, and other conditions that affect the brain cognitive process. Then this can compromise a person's ability to benefit from text. So when we do blog posts or documentation, then we should take into account certain things, like simple language. This means that you should put your information in a logical order, with the important details first. Try to fit your language to your audience and the context. And also try to provide definitions for unusual words or abbreviations. And try to be as literal as possible, because some people with cognitive disabilities have a very hard time distinguishing between literal meaning of something and the implied meaning, meaning that sarcasm and parody can be especially confusing for many people. And for the fonts also are very important. You should choose the right font. So ideally for reading, a sans serif font is recommended, because the sans serif are the ones that doesn't have the little twirls on the edges. And this is easier to read. And also taking account the font size, the character spacing, and the icon fonts. If you're using icon fonts, maybe someone has their own font. Many people have their own custom font that apply on the browser, and this will override your fonts. And if you are using icon fonts, then they will be broken and no one will be able to see them. So you should also take care of this when using icon fonts or when using your own custom fonts. And maybe check what happens when you resize up to 400% or change the text spacing. If their information is getting lost in this, then if you're resizing like 400% and you cannot read, then there's something there that needs to be fixed. Also clutter. With clutter, I mean more like big paragraphs, like walls of text. This should be breaking down, because they're very hard to read for everyone, I believe. And trying to go through all of this text is very cumbersome. So ideally, you should have like very clear paragraph, short, with spacing between them, and they are more easy to read. And along with text also comes media. So in media, we can find things like videos, sounds, ads, etc. So for the case of videos, we should always try to provide captions. So captions will help someone who has low or no hearing, or maybe someone who cannot actually listen to our video and it's in, for example, a library or a loud bar without headphones. And then this person should be able to consume the content regardless of the environment. And in the case of autoplay ads and videos, we should not do this, because a lot of people who, for example, has ADHD reports that all of these animations, autoplay ads, videos moving around in the website are very distracting and takes them away from the main content of the page or the action that they wanted to do. So this can be, or maybe also can trigger headaches, migraine, etc. And in the case of the transcriptions, if you, for example, run a podcast, make sure to provide transcriptions. This helps a lot of people. Many people follow along the text with the sound, and also helps people that have low or no hearing at all. And in general, I will say test. Always test. The tools that we need to test for accessibility, we already have. We can listen to our websites. So if you're in Mac, you can activate VoiceOver with Safari and listen. What happens? Try to navigate the website this way. Can you complete everything? Can you understand what is happening in there? And at the beginning, if you've never done this, it will be very confusing. It was for me. It was very frustrating, all of this information coming up so fast. And with time, you will get used to it, because this is the same road that people that use screen readers have to go through, because many of these people, they're self-taught. So they come into this tool, they are thrown into the web, and they need to learn how to navigate them. And on top of that, we're making our websites not really accessible. So everything that they're listening to, everything that they're navigating, is very confusing. So maybe try this. Or for example, if you're in Windows, you can also download JAWS and there are other screen readers. At the end of the talk, I will leave you with a link for a repository with a bunch of different tools and resources. And also in Chrome, there's Chromebox, which is also a screen reader for Chrome. So there are many ways that you can actually listen to your website. And also, forget about your mouse. Disconnect it, disable it, and try to tap through your website. The tab key is your best friend in this case. Can you accomplish everything that you could with the mouse, with the keyboard? If yes, then perfect. If not, then there is something that you need to fix or needs to be fixed. And after all of this talk, who benefits from accessibility? I would say everyone. When we break down paragraph and provide a nice font, then we're helping someone with ADHD or dyslexia. When we fix our mouse-only interactions and make them accessible with the keyboard, then someone with Parkinson or chronic pain will be able to use our site. And when we stop autoplaying videos, then people with cognitive disorders will be also able to use it. So all of these things that I'm talking about might seem small, right? But the thing is that small changes have a really big impact, and you never know who you're helping with this. And maybe you might think, oh yeah, adding these alt attributes is very easy, but not a lot of people do it. And as we can see, a bunch of different websites are also missing this. So all of these small changes will help and will benefit a lot of people, including you, because by now, we're getting older, our bodies are deteriorating, and we will also be in a situation where we experiment a disability. And we might already have, maybe you broke your hand and are not able to use the mouse. So in this case, you will need to use the keyboard. How would you feel if you couldn't do anything that you used to do, right? So these things are also benefit for ourselves and for many, many people. So my last recommendation is let's get out of our boxes. Let's start seeing the world from a different perspective, diversify your team, test with actual people, and try to experience from another point of view, and bring all of this into what you create. And little by little, doing small changes, including accessibility in your everyday processes, then we are helping to make the web a better place and a more welcoming place for everyone. So that's it. My name is Marjorie. That's my Twitter account, and this is the link to the repositories that I told you about.
Awesome, Marjorie. Thank you so much. Are you guys able to hear me? I'm having some kind of trouble with my Chrome. I was just checking the activity monitor now, like the processing would jump to almost 300 at some point. I think it's this StreamYard that we are using. But anyways, let's see if we have some questions from our attendees. I myself have a few questions as well and some comments. I really liked what you said about the about choosing the right font. There are actually some studies out there that have that show a very strong correlation between people's understanding of what they are reading and how much interest they have for it. So if you make something easier for them to read, odds are they will like it better, even.
Yeah, exactly. When we use very fancy fonts, we might think, oh, they look really nice. But if it's like a bunch of text and this font is like very tied together, then you're not really able to read it, even if it looks nice.
Yeah, you make it look like word art. I don't know if a lot of people remember that from back in the day when you're playing with PowerPoint. But yeah, it's also something that I really liked and made me think quite a bit, because I mentioned that I have quite a few friends who have a disability. One of them also, because you mentioned about stopping to use the mouse and actually trying to use your website just using the keyboard. This friend of mine, he actually got in an accident, I think 8 or 7 years ago, I can't remember, but he lost the movements on his right hand. So as much as he can, he will try to control everything using his left hand and just the keyboard. So it is indeed a very important feature to make your website navigable using your only your keyboard. So that was very interesting as well. But let's see if anybody has any questions. I just want to give them a few more minutes. Now, Marjorie, in your job today, do you guys have guidelines in your team for accessibility as well? Like, what kind of peer review does the work go through in order to make sure that you're delivering stuff that is actually accessible?
Yeah, so to be honest, I came to this topic very late in my career. This is not something that I got taught in university or anything. I just stumbled upon when I started working on this on my current job, and it happened the same way that I mentioned it happened. We started to get complaints from someone who was blind and couldn't use our website. And then they were, okay, what can we do? And then they started, and this was kind of recently, they started to kind of get more interested. And then we did some audits and we're still working on it. So it's not like I will say it's 100% accessible or anything, but the concepts and ideas of making things accessible are spreading through the different teams, because it's a really big company. You might not think about it because online shop might be 10 people, but it's like 500 people working on this. And yeah, so slowly it's spreading and you can see the change. And sometimes the change is slow, but it's important that it's constant and that it's happening. So slowly people are starting to take care more of it. Developers are starting to make tests and so on. So you can see kind of the accessibility going into their mind.
Yeah, hopefully one day everybody's going to do this out of love. But for now, I'm okay with people losing points in the SEO scores. So they will get forced to do these things. But Marjorie, I wanted to once again thank you very much for being with us today and for preparing this talk. I feel like this subject is something that people should really give more attention to. And one way or another, it will happen, because SEO will bite you in the ass at some point if you don't take care of accessibility. So thank you very much for being with us, and hopefully we can hear from you again in the future.
Sure. Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Yeah. All right. So I want to bring this guy, I guess I was going to say on stage, but we don't really have a stage, right? This is the stage right now. Oh, let me unmute. Hey, Nader, welcome.
Hey, how are you? Thank you for having me. This is my stage behind me. I need something a little nicer for the next time there, right?
Holy crap, I'm looking at that. I see that you have like pretty much like a recording studio with you.
Yeah, this is where I do a lot of podcasts, videos, events nowadays. So
yeah. For those of you who are watching us right now, if you're not familiar with Nader, Nader, I mean, it is an honor to have him here, because he is a senior developer advocate at AWS. So he knows quite a bit about AWS. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Kitsy as well, but I know that Nader has been releasing some stuff with Kitsy as well, showing people how to use a lot of the services within AWS, right?
Yeah, today we did a pretty long stream, actually like a 2-hour stream, talking about some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about here. And, when you think of AWS, you typically think of backend, but I'm actually a front-end developer, and I've started to become a full-stack developer on the cloud. But I'm really just a React Native Vue developer. That's kind of what I would categorize myself as.
I see that great minds think alike, because I myself am a front-end developer as well. And I started using AWS because I wanted to make things a little bit easier for me. Most recently, I deployed this endpoint, a serverless endpoint for GraphQL. And to me, it was amazing. I was just trying to make my life a little bit easier. And people have this mindset that they think that only people who work with backend are going to use those services, but they can make your life so much easier, even in the front end.
Well, that's perfect, because my talk is literally about this.
Oh, awesome. So I was looking forward to it already. But yeah, so Nader, it's not the first time that we have Nader. He's been with us in a lot of other conferences as well. We are very happy to have him with us today. As I said, he's a senior developer advocate at AWS, and he's done a lot of awesome stuff in the past as well. I believe he's also a founder and trainer at React Native Training, right?
Right.
Yeah, you're still doing that. That's awesome.
Yeah, we still do a lot of training. I don't do the training anymore, but the consultants that I work with kind of still do a lot of training. Yeah.
Yeah. So Nader has a lot of experience, and it will be great to hear from you today. So without delaying it anymore, maybe you want to share your screen. I'm not sure if you have planned.
Yeah, let me go ahead.
Yeah, and then I'll put it up for you.
Move this over here. And
if you guys ever get to see Nader in person, you see that he's definitely a guy who works out and stands out in the crowd. I remember this first time when I saw him at the conference, he was crossing ways with me, and he just looked like this big buff guy coming to my direction.
Okay, cool. I haven't been working out as much lately because of the quarantine, but still trying.
Yeah, I've been trying to do my best with the bends as well. But we do what you can, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, we got your desktop up now, so I'm gonna leave it to it. Time is yours, Nader.
Okay, yeah. So welcome to my talk. It's called Transforming GraphQL, and really what it's about is mainly around kind of how to use front-end skill set, just kind of what we were talking about earlier, to build full-stack serverless apps. And one of the things that comes into play as far as doing this on AWS, which is kind of what I'm talking about today, is this library that we're going to be talking about called the GraphQL Transform Library. So that's kind of why my talk is called Transforming GraphQL. It's kind of going to be talking about end-to-end solutions for full stack development on the cloud. So my name is Nader Dabbit. You can find me on Twitter, Medium, GitHub, and dev.to at Dabbit3. I'm a web and mobile developer by trade. I've been doing that for about 9 or 10 years now. And I'm also an author and a podcaster. The 2 books that I've written right now are React Native in Action and Full Stack Serverless. And Full Stack Serverless is actually that's the name of the book, but it's also the topic that I'm going to be talking about in just a moment. So if you're interested in some of the stuff I'm talking about, definitely check out that book. It's already available through O'Reilly Publications. And like I mentioned earlier, I work at AWS. And when people think of AWS, they typically think of backend development or servers. They think of DevOps and infrastructure. But we actually have an entire team that is focused on front-end technologies or client technologies. So the things that my team work on are libraries for interacting with backend services written in React, Vue, React Native, just all of the web frameworks, as well as native iOS, native Android, and we're now starting to even get into Flutter. So we're building basically tooling, client SDKs, all kinds of stuff, allowing people to kind of use their front-end skill set to easily get up and running with the same, back-end infrastructure on that is AWS, that you see companies like Netflix, Airbnb, Ticketmaster, all these big companies that are kind of using it. What we're trying to do is kind of lower the barrier to entry to kind of enable people to use those scalable services and using your front-end skill set. So full stack serverless is kind of something you'll hear a lot when you see a lot of the stuff that we're doing. And what this really is kind of like a way of building apps where you have your front-end application interacting with APIs that are managed services or managed APIs. So when you think of something like an authentication service, for example, and you're a front-end developer and you want to build an app that needs authentication, do you decide to open your text editor and start writing this logic from scratch and then host it on a server and write all of that backend code? Or do you typically think that maybe I can reach for a service like Auth0 or a managed service that kind of does all that for me, and then all I have to do is then interact with that service? That service has hundreds or thousands of developers focused full-time on that one thing that they are getting right. All I need to do is kind of buy into that API. Well, full stack serverless is basically saying, okay, anytime that we want to build a feature, we're going to first check and see if we can find something like that is already existing, we can just hook into. So for example, for authentication, I mentioned something like Auth0 would fit into this paradigm. We have stuff on AWS that's like a managed identity service that I'll talk about in just a moment. Things like Hasura, which is a really great GraphQL as a service. Prisma, I'm not sure if they still have their backend as a service, Firebase, things like that kind of would fall into this category. And therefore, you're kind of using your front-end skill set. And as we build better and better abstractions on the backend, you're actually able to build the same full stack scalable applications that teams of engineers used to take. You can do that on your own now. And this is getting better and better and better. Now, for our team in particular, we have a couple of things that we work on. One of them is the Amplify framework, and one of them is AWS AppSync. And AWS AppSync is really something that is a GraphQL as a service. So for instance, if you want to create a GraphQL API, you typically have to think about pieces like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and create an Apollo server or whatever server implementation you'd like to work with. You need to then host that somewhere. You then need to spin up a database and connect that server to the database. And you need to write all of the authentication logic, all the authorization logic. You have to think about things like security, things like DDoS attacks, all these things for protecting your API, right? So what AppSync does, it basically abstracts all of that for you. So you can just basically run one command or click a button, and you have your backend as a service of GraphQL spun up, and you're able to then just start interacting with it. And it's a serverless service in the sense that you don't ever have to mess with it. Like, it goes up anytime something needs updating, anytime the server needs patching, all that stuff is kind of handled for you. So it kind of makes the backend part really abstracted away, and you can just actually start writing your business logic and all of the features that you like. So that's AppSync. And then Amplify is another piece that we work on. It's basically combined of three things. One of them is a command line interface. And you basically would be able to open your command line and create services. So if you want authentication, you would say, I want authentication by saying amplify add auth. If you want a GraphQL backend, you would say amplify add API, choose GraphQL. You want a REST API, you want S3, whatever, you kind of run all of those commands. So that's the CLI. And then we have the client library that after you've created the service, you use the client library to then make an API call to that service. So you might say, okay, I have this authentication service. I'm going to use the client library to sign in. I'm going to use the client library to send an API call to the GraphQL API. And then the third main piece is a hosting service. So if you've ever needed to host a static site globally on a global CDN and have everything managed with CI/CD, that's kind of the third thing that's built into this. But putting these things together, we can basically use Amplify to spin up any type of AWS service that is supported by Amplify. And we have tight integrations with some of these services, and GraphQL Transform is a piece of the Amplify library that works with AppSync. And basically it allows you to do this. You can write your GraphQL schema with these directives that we're going to look at in just a moment. And when you decorate your schema with the directives using the Amplify CLI, we can then make updates to your AppSync backend. So what are some of these directives? Well, there are really 7 main ones that we have right now. @model is going to be the one that does really the most. And this allows you to create a base type. Like if you think of an app, something like a to-do app, and if you're writing a to-do app in GraphQL, you might have a to-do type that has an ID, it might have like a name, and it might have like a description, right? So you have this to-do type. Now, from that point on, what do you need to do to turn that into a real usable backend if you're working with GraphQL? Well, first of all, you're going to need to have GraphQL operations. So create, read, update, delete. So that would be a GraphQL mutation. So you need to kind of define those operations in your schema. You then need to create a backend database. So you might then spin up your database. So you have those two pieces. And then the last thing you're going to need is GraphQL resolvers that allow those GraphQL operations to talk to your backend. So all of that put together is typically a lot of boilerplate, but using the @model directive, you can pretty much just decorate any GraphQL type, and we will spin up all of that additional schema. We'll create a database, and we'll create the resolvers and wire everything together. And then if you have business logic that you'd like to write, you can then just update your resolvers, and then you're kind of already ready to go. The other two that I'll talk about, @connection allows you to create one-to-many, many-to-one, or many-to-many relationships. And then @auth allows you to define authorization rules. And then we have a few other like @searchable that allows you to create Elasticsearch backends. But really, the main ones we're going to focus on are @model, @auth, and @connection. And the challenge that I'm going to kind of give myself here, and then we're going to look at a bunch of examples that I've built with this and maybe talk about a few companies that are kind of using this. I want to build a conference API, and I want to do this in 5 minutes, okay? I want to create the schema. I want to create the resolvers. I want to create the database. I want to create authorization rules and model the relationships between the types. And I want to test this all out, okay? So that's the idea. And one of the things that we're really focused on with this library and with everything that we do is developer velocity, because we think the faster that people can iterate, the faster they can test things out and try things out without a lot of wasted time or wasted money, then you're able to then iterate quickly and therefore be ahead of your competition, or at least be able to keep up with ideas that are being brought out there. Because if you spend days, weeks, months building out an idea, it doesn't work, you've kind of forfeited that time where you could have been doing something else. So developer velocity. So with that in mind, I'm going to jump over to the command line. And basically what we're going to do is we're inside of an Amplify project. The only thing I've done so far is I've initialized an Amplify app. And after I've done that, you'll see that we have this Amplify folder. And to initialize an Amplify app, you just run Amplify init. And I've already kind of done that. So what we want to do is we want to build this API. So I'm going to run amplify add API, and then from here, we're going to go ahead and create this API. And then we're going to test it out. So for the for the API type, we're going to choose GraphQL. For the next step, we're going to give the API a name. I'll call this conference API. For the authorization type, we can choose either API key. We can use Cognito user pool, which is a managed authentication service like Auth0. Or we can choose OpenID Connect, which allows you to bring any authentication provider that you like. So I'm going to choose Cognito user pool, which is that managed service. We don't have advanced settings. If we had a GraphQL schema already created, we could just reference it here, but we don't. Instead, we'll take this guided schema creation, which will give us 3 boilerplate schemas that we can start with. So I'll start with the to-do app, and we'll go ahead and edit the schema now. And this should go ahead and open up the schema in a text editor. And if you see here what we're starting off with, we're starting off with this really basic schema with a type of to-do. But what we want is a conference API. So what we basically need is a talk type and a comment type. So let's go ahead and start with that talk type. The talk type is going to have a talk name, a talk summary, a speaker name, and a speaker bio. Okay. So what we also noticed though is we have this @model directive, and this is going to create all of the additional schema for create, read, update, delete, all of that stuff. It'll also create GraphQL subscriptions, so we can listen to when a new talk is created, updated, or deleted. The next thing we want to do is create a comment type. We notice that we also decorate this type with an @model directive. We give it a few fields, like the comment has a message, a created at, and a created by. The created by is going to be interesting because this will populate based on the person that is signed in, and we'll look at how that works in just a moment. The next thing we want to do is we want to create a relationship between a talk and a comment. So if someone creates a comment, we want to be able to identify that comment based on the talk that it's associated with. So the first thing we need to do to kind of get that going is we're going to create a relationship between the comments and the talk by using this @connection directive. And then we want to create the other piece of this relationship right here by creating a talk and a comment relationship by, again, using this @connection. So this way we can not only define which talk a comment belongs to, but we can also query all of the talks and then get all of the child comments for that talk in a single GraphQL query. Finally, what we want to do is define some authorization rules. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to say that only an admin can create a talk, because this is going to be something like the admin panel, right? You don't want anyone to be able to kind of hit this API and then delete or add talks, because this is kind of a secure piece of data. But maybe for the comments, we do want to allow anyone to create a comment, and we want to allow only the owner of that comment to be able to update or delete. So we'll look at that in just a moment. But for the rules for an admin, we can set allow to groups. So we're going to say, okay, we want a certain groups to be able to do everything. And the groups that we want to allow are admin. And then for the queries, we want to go ahead and set all of the rules to null. So we want to allow anyone to be able to query talks, but only admins to be able to create, update, or delete. And then the last piece of rule that we're going to add here is auth rules for a comment, because here we want to allow anyone to create a comment. So this allow owner will basically say, okay, we're going to associate each comment with the person that created it. We're going to set an owner field, and the owner field is going to be this created by. And then finally, we also want to set the queries to null, because we want to let everyone be able to basically query this API. So we want everyone to be able to read the comments, but only the people that created it to be able to update or delete. So now that we've done that, we're done with our schema. We can go back to our terminal. And what we're going to do now is test this thing out. So it's going to go ahead and check our schema, make sure it's valid. It will then compile it. And then after that, we'll get some feedback saying it's been compiled successfully. And then what we can then do is we can actually go ahead and test this out locally. So what I'll do is I'll run amplify mock API. And this is going to go ahead and mock that GraphQL API. And what it's going to basically do is going to go ahead and look at our schema. It's going to see that we have those @model directives, and it's going to create 2 local databases for us. It's going to create one for the talk and one for the comment. And that's kind of what's running in the background right here. And then after that's done, we should get some feedback saying we've created the talk table and we've created the comment table. And then now it's going to run an additional command for GraphQL code generation. It's going to go ahead and create the operations that we'll need to interact with this API locally. So we can choose TypeScript, JavaScript, or Flow. We can choose the location of this of where this code will be created. We can generate all or some of these operations, and then we can choose at what depth do we want to be able to query these operations. So after that, we should see that the operations were successfully created and saved, and now we should see a mock endpoint running a graphical editor basically locally. So now we should be able to go ahead and open that graphical editor up. And here we have our GraphQL interface, and we can actually start interacting with this locally. So the first thing we might want to do would be to create a new talk. So I'm going to go to mutation down here and go ahead and create a mutation here. And I'm going to create a talk, and we're going to give the talk a speaker bio. We'll give the speaker name. We'll give the talk name. Then we'll give a talk summary. Okay, so let's try this out and see what happens. So what we're going to see is that we got actually an unauthorized error. And this is actually exactly what we said we wanted, right? Because we said that we only want admins to be able to create new mutations for a new talk. Well, in the graphical editor, we can actually go into this update auth section, and we can generate a JWT that we'll then use to authenticate the person. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and basically sign in, and I'll set myself as an admin. And then when we click generate token, this is going to create a JWT that will be sent with this request and authorized on the server. So now if I click create mutation, we now see that this was created successfully. So creating the talk is successful. Let's go ahead and update auth and sign in as another user that will be simulating a comment. And we'll go ahead and generate a new token. And for this mutation, I'll create a new comment. And we're going to need this reference to this talk ID for that relationship. So for the comment talk ID, I'll paste that in. I will then set the message as great talk. That's it. That's all we need. Just these 2 fields, the message and the comment talk ID. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually return the created by, which you notice we're not passing in, right? The created by is actually going to be read off of that JWT. So if we go ahead and create this mutation, we see that, oh, it looks like we have some type of error here. Oh, I think I know why, because I'm also creating this talk. Let's try that again. I'm going to create one more mutation. And we see that we've created this comment. And you see that created by was actually populated. So that's all working good. The last thing we want to do is let's go ahead and sign back in now as a third user. And this user just wants to read the API. So this person just wants to go ahead and query the talks and then see the comments on all the talks. So to do that, we can use the list talks query. We're going to go ahead and return all of this info. But you'll now notice that we can now query the relationship between the talks and the comments. So not only can we get all of the talks, but we can also get the comments. And from here, we'll get all of the information for those comments. So now we should be able to run this query. We see that we have the talk information, but we also have this array of items, which is pretty sweet because we did all of that, within about 5 minutes. A couple of other things to deploy this. So we've only created this locally. To deploy that, we would be able to run Amplify push. But let's say we wanted to test this out locally. To do that, we can actually go ahead and install Amplify, and we can go ahead and try this out. And I'm going to go ahead and add AWS Amplify and AWS Amplify React. These are going to be the two libraries that we're going to need to kind of interact with both our authentication and the actual API. And then I'm going to show a few different examples of some apps that we've built using this stuff. And while that's running, actually, I'll go ahead and show this app. So Conference App in a Box is actually a very similar app to the one I just built here. And it's been used by dozens and dozens of events at this point. And the schema that we just looked at looks very similar to the schema that I've used here, but this is a full stack serverless app. So you can actually deploy both the front end and the back end using AWS Amplify CLI. And if you look here in the code, we have this Amplify folder, which holds the back end, which has the API and the authentication kind of all set up. So you basically would clone this, run Amplify init, Amplify push, and then you have your full stack app ready to go. You can basically theme this with around 4 lines of code to kind of match your conference. So let's go ahead and test this out, though. So let's go ahead and open up this project in our text editor. And what we want to do is just query our API for the talks. Nothing crazy, but we want to just test it out to see if it's working against our local endpoint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open index.js, and I'm going to go ahead and import Amplify from AWS Amplify. I'm going to import this configuration that's coming in from this AWS exports file that we'll take a look at in just a moment. And then I'll call amplify.configure, passing in the config. So we're importing the Amplify library, we're importing this configuration, and we're calling amplify.config. So what's up with this configuration file? Let's go ahead and open that up and take a look at it. Well, when you create services via the CLI, the references to those get placed here locally. But when we run Amplify mock and we want to test everything out, you'll notice that some of these endpoints get updated with temporary and local credentials. So we see that our actual GraphQL endpoint is no longer an HTTP endpoint pointing at the web. It's actually pointing at our local host because we're now operating against this GraphQL API running locally. So that's pretty sweet. So we have that there. The thing we want to do now is we're going to go ahead and open app.js, and we'll go ahead and import use effect and use state from React. And we'll go ahead and create some initial state. We'll go ahead and set some talks and set talks. Set that to an empty array. We'll then have a function called fetch talks. And then we'll also have a use effect. And this is going to then call fetch talks. So in this fetch talks function, what we want to do is we're going to do is import this API category from AWS Amplify. And what we want to do is basically call the API that is running locally to go ahead and fetch that data. So in fetch talks, we're going to say, let's go ahead and set some talk data. And we'll set that to await API.GraphQL. And then here we're going to set the GraphQL query that we'd like to set. And the query that we'd like to set is the list talks query. But where are we getting this list talks query? Because right now we haven't created any query locally. Well, if you remember in the CLI, it actually created this GraphQL folder. So we can actually go to GraphQL queries, and we'll see that all of the different queries that we needed were generated for us by the command line. So now I'll go back to our app, and I can just import that list query, that list talks query. Okay, so we have that list talks query imported, and then now we'll just go ahead and console.log this data. And I think the property that we're going to need here is going to be It's going to be talkdata.data.listTalks.items. So basically, we're going to be getting the data off of this request. We're going to be then getting the list talks query. And then we can either return the items or the next token for pagination. And since we're not paginating, all we need is just those items. But we're going to log that out just to be sure. Okay, so we're good to go now. We should be able to test this out. So I'm going to run npm start. And we're going to need to do a couple of things. Actually, I think we need to do one more thing here. What we need to do is also, if you remember, we have this API that is authenticated. So we still need to kind of be able to sign in. So how can we actually spin up a sign-in form? We can do that really quickly by just importing this with authenticator component. From AWS Amplify, React. And then for the default export, what we'll do is we'll just change it to the with authenticator. Okay. Let's go ahead and run this on another port, and we should be good to go. We'll see. That was a lot of code typed really fast. So let's see if I made any mistakes. And the cool thing, one of the cool things is we'll be able to kind of test this out and then query that data locally and see, if we make any updates. But I'm not sure we're going to make any updates. I think we might just be querying the data. Yeah, and my computer is running a little slow today, so I apologize. And I might see if I can cut off some other node processes that are happening right now. That might be slowing down my computer.
It might be Chrome. That's my problem over here.
Oh, yeah?
It's making everything laggy, yeah. StreamYard apparently uses a lot of memory.
I really think because I had so much stuff running locally, it could have made it even worse. We'll see.
Yeah, I started having to close everything here to see if it would work, but
we've come so far.
No, that's cool though. Yeah, maybe while we wait for this, I had a few questions. Oh, and some comments as well, because I'm a little bit mind blown actually. It makes me feel like my implementation is so naive because I'm not using Amplify to do the stuff that I'm doing. And I'm basically just deploying an endpoint using the serverless framework and Apollo Server Lambda.
Oh, yeah, that's a good option too. I mean, yeah. Like I just did a lot of demos with that over the last couple of weeks because a lot of people want to do that. And there's trade-offs. It's good and bad things that are there. So, it's definitely worth the discussion, but that's not a bad way of going about it because you still have the scalability of serverless, but you're missing some of the features that AppSync provides. But if you don't need those features, then it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
All right.
There it is. I'm going to leave so we can continue this later.
Okay. It looks like I'm missing some CSS here. So normally this form would be like a lot nicer. But for right now, let's not worry about that. What we want to do is let's go ahead and sign up and create a new account. So I'm going to go ahead and sign up Dabbit3. Okay, so create an account, and I should get an email with my password, or I'm sorry, with my MFA code. So go ahead and put that here. Okay, so we confirm that. We should be able to sign in. Okay, signing in. We go ahead and inspect this element. Okay, so we're signed in. And in the app, we should be able to go ahead and console.log this data, right? Because we fetched it, and now we see that we have these list talks items. And there we go. We see that we have our information. And now the last thing we might want to do is just render that data in our app. So I'm going to go ahead and just, what do we call this? Talks.map. And for now, we'll just return like an H1 with the talk name, and then we'll just set the key as the talk.id. And then we'll refresh. And again, my computer is running a little slow, but it shouldn't be too bad just to refresh. Okay, something's going on there. Looks like talk name. Okay, so we have that. So our data is rendering. The one last cool thing it might be to do would be to create a new talk and then update and make sure that went through. So we'll go ahead and create a new talk. We'll call this View Amsterdam, right? Or Frontend Love.
This one is for Frontend Love.
I
But both of them are in our
already.
hearts. Both of them are in our hearts. So
Speaker name, okay. Talk name, okay. Front. We already miss Frontend Love. Okay, anyway, whatever. This is just, filling in some data, whatever. Okay, let's go ahead and create that mutation. Not authorized, so I'll go ahead and set this person in that admin group. Take the mutation, and then refresh. We should now see we have 2 talks. All right, so the app is working. We kind of set all this up really quickly, right? I mean, we've only been writing code for about 10 minutes total, a lot of talking in between. So that's kind of much the gist of it. And if you want to see some open source versions of apps that I've built using this stuff, we haven't even looked at the real-time functionality, but there's a lot of stuff that you can do with this, and you can do it really quickly. So this is one app that I wrote. It's called Write With Me. It's basically a way to create collaborative document writing. It's like a collaborative document writing app. So let's go ahead and create a new post called Frontend Love Meetup. And this is that post. And what we want to do now is we want to collaborate with this on this with someone. And in this we can actually write Markdown. So if I want to write some code, I can write code. We can also do stuff like this is a secondary header. And then we can also do stuff like using images and stuff. So we could say something like that. And we see all that stuff that's coming through in real time. And then I could go over here on this side, and I can also say I am editing. We see it come through on the right side over here. So this is a pretty cool use case, because you could then think about how could you build something like Google Docs. Well, this implementation is using GraphQL subscriptions to kind of make these real-time updates, and you can do that pretty easily with that type of setup. Another app that I kind of like to show off that's similar to this is called Hypebeats, and this is a beat machine that's collaborative. I do like these collaborative types of apps because they show off the power of real-time stuff really in a cool fashion. So we have these 2 beatboxes. And let's say we want to collaborate on them together. We can actually share the link, and everyone can then get it. And then we can make updates and kind of see that the updates then propagate to the different beatboxes. So we can actually go ahead and test this out by doing like that. And we can create music using GraphQL subscriptions, basically. And then if I wanted to make changes over here, I'm not good at music, but you know, something that we made. So the way this is working is basically we're taking the schema of this beat machine, which is essentially a bunch of ones and zeros. 0 means the beat is off, 1, the beat is on. And we stringify that and we store that in our GraphQL server. And then anytime an update is made, the listener on the other beatbox hears that there's a change, sends that whole stringified schema, and then parses it and then kind of re-renders only the changes. And then the last one I'll show you is speaker chat, very similar to the other one where I showed you, Write With Me. But here you could basically say, let's say that you gave a meetup and you wanted to have a place for people to discuss that talk. For this meetup, we might say transforming GraphQL. Speaker name is Nader. And then I'm going to take this link here and I'm going to start creating some messages. And we should see that, like, I'm going to create a comment that says, like, what does this mean? And then maybe put some code. And then make this comment. And then we see that it comes through in real time. And you can actually write Markdown to communicate with that speaker, which is really cool because when you're in a conference and you see code and you want to maybe put images, you might want to do all kinds of cool stuff. You can do that using Markdown. Okay, cool. So yeah, that's it. That's the end of my talk. I appreciate you checking it out. Yeah, that's really about it. If you want to follow me on Twitter, Dabbit3. I'm actually writing a couple of really cool apps that I'm going to be open sourcing in the next 2 weeks. And they're along these lines of real-time collaborative type of stuff. I'd love for you to check it out.
Thank you so much, Nader. I'm speechless, actually, because I was mind blown by all this. I was actually trying to learn how to do all of this the other day, looking up some documentation. I was actually going to ask you then. I mean, this has obviously been very informative as well. You pretty much gave us the bread and the butter, everything ready. But can you also point us out to some kind of documentation or a learning path if somebody wants to really go deep into what you shared with us today?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Good question. And I would say that, like, there's 3 main places I would go. First of all, we just released some new documentation. And this is the new docs. It's docs.awsamplify.com. We're spending a lot of extra time and effort on our docs because we feel that we've started to gain a lot of adoption and we weren't putting enough effort into them in the past. So we spent a lot of time on these new docs and we will continue improving these. So this is a great place to start to learn how to do all of the basics. If you want to take this a little further and see some example projects, the projects that I showed off and a lot of other ones are in this GitHub repo called Awesome AWS Amplify. So you can see all the stuff I talked about, but you can also see a lot of other stuff from the community. We have around 200, a list of around 200 curated blog post example projects, things like that. And they're all located here. I need to make some updates because the last update we made is about 2 months ago. And then we also have the AWS Amplify community. This website basically is another place where we post all of our upcoming meetups and events and also resources from the community. Posts from the community. And we also have resources. So if you would like to either take or give a workshop or a talk, we actually have workshops that are pre-built and just handed to you that you could use. And a lot of these are like GitHub repos where you just walk through and build out an end-to-end application. And then we have slide decks as well. So if you want to kind of give your own talk, we can actually give you a completed slide deck and coach you through how to kind of present at a meetup like this if you want to do that yourself.
That's amazing. So you're basically empowering people to be able to actually spread this information. This is awesome.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's a good scalable way because a lot of people want to get into speaking and they want to get into the community, but maybe they've never done anything like this before. This is good for us because it helps us kind of spread awareness, and it's also good for them because they don't have to start from scratch, you know?
Yeah. And one of the best ways of learning is also teaching. So
there you go.
But yeah, and I'm going to have, I mean, I'm supposed to present my stuff next week to my colleagues, and this is definitely going to help me add some spice to it, put the cherry on top of the cake. So That's good. So, I mean, if I understand it correctly, then I guess the trade-off that I get with the approach that I mentioned to you earlier, just basically using Apollo Server Lambda in a common, I guess, simple serverless handler. It's not a bad approach, right? It's just that you don't get a whole lot of the stuff that you showed us, for example, the subscriptions and all of that. You kind of have to do those by hand if you're going to do it the way that I did, right?
Yeah, so I would say like the biggest trade-off when running a GraphQL server in a Lambda function is the real-time piece, the subscriptions. You can get it working, but it's actually quite a bit of work to get it right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I haven't done it.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I haven't actually seen anyone do it yet. That's how hard it is. Now, I've seen a lot of people build WebSocket stuff in Lambda, because I know you can do it now with API Gateway, but I just haven't done it. And when I tried to look into it, it looked really hard, and I'm lazy. So, like, if I can do something easily and it works and it scales, like we have companies like Ticketmaster that have been using this stuff for like 3 years with millions of customers at one time. I mean, connections at one time. So we know it works. I'm just lazy. I don't want to build something that's going to take me a long time if I can find another way to do it, right? But there's the good use cases for running your own server on Lambda. So I would just look at your kind of like, your application needs and just decide from there what's right. There's no one right answer for everything. So.
Yeah, what I'm doing right now is actually very, very simple. It's just a budgeting app that I picked just as a learning experience, because I wanted to learn the whole serverless stuff. And also because I was getting interested in GraphQL. But yeah, I think the good side of things is that if you do the approach that I did, then you get to learn a few things that usually would be abstracted away if you're using Amplify. And then you get to understand those things a little bit better. But I guess that's the only trade-off, as far as I can see, because the stuff you showed us today is so amazing. One last question I have for you, also waiting to see if somebody from our attendees are going to have any questions. For a front-end developer, somebody who wants to get certified with AWS, which certification do you think is probably the most appropriate? Because I know that you can very easily drink water from a fire hose depending on which one you pick.
I think the solutions architect one is pretty interesting because it's not like beginner, but it's not like too advanced. It's kind of right there in the middle. It's challenging as hell. It's for sure hard to get, but it's one of those things that if you get it, you'll be able to kind of have a really good grasp on everything, but you'll also be able to make a lot of money based on experiences that I've seen. And to me, like, I care a lot about that.
Yeah, those skills are sought for in the market. Yeah. No doubt about that. Yeah, and another question that I had as well. So a lot of this functionality is abstracted away when you use Amplify, like we just talked about with the subscriptions. Is there a big difference in the pricing for the services that you're using with AWS if you're using this approach that you showed us today instead of actually just deploying a normal serverless handler?
Yes, that's a good point too. Yeah, it's definitely going to be more expensive to use an AppSync as the service itself. You can actually go to AppSync pricing to see how it is, but if you're a new developer to AWS, it's actually free for the first year. After that, there are pricing. I think there's a couple of examples. One of the examples was like, let's say you have an app with 50,000 daily active users, or something like that, and then each user spends like 5 minutes interacting with the app or something like that. The pricing is kind of laid out like for those type of examples. And I think something like that would be like $21 a month. But I think what you start seeing with AppSync in particular is the pricing starts getting more expensive if you have a lot of GraphQL subscriptions that are connected at one time, because the queries and mutations are actually very cheap. The subscriptions are also cheap, but when you have so many things happening in an app, then that can start to get out of control if it's not monitored.
So we're not talking about. So we're talking about, for example, a use case where you have like 100 people subscribing to the same piece of data. For example, like 100 people were using the app that you just showed us.
Yeah, I mean,
so if you're doing just like
people, like I'm thinking more of the scale of like 1 million. Like 100 people is not gonna cost you anything. Now, like when the numbers typically start to get like in the hundreds of dollars when you start getting into the millions of operations.
But I guess the point that I'm trying to illustrate is that like for you to reach that limit, and when things start to actually get very, very expensive, it's a very rare use case, because even if you have like a messaging app that you're doing peer-to-peer messages, for example, and you're using subscriptions, right? I mean, when are you ever going to have like 1 million people in one group?
Yeah, I mean, this discussion is really interesting to me, because this is actually a discussion that a lot of people have when they're choosing whether or not they want to build and maintain their own infrastructure, like create a server or an EC2 instance somewhere and pay for that, or if they want to use a quote-unquote serverless service like AppSync. So if you create a Lambda function, or if you create an AppSync API, or S3, whatever, you're actually not paying anything for that. You're only paying when people start using it. Mm-hmm. So when you start thinking about the pricing models and the differences there, with serverless, you're typically paying for that compute time versus that compute power, and just paying for that monthly. So with Lambda, you're not going to pay anything until you have a bunch of people using it. And the idea here is typically you don't actually start seeing high bills or bills that are like anything at all until you have a shitload of users. So like that's a cool thing that to me, because you're able to then have a startup and you can build out your entire app, and it doesn't really cost you anything until you start getting those users. And typically once you have a lot of users, the problem of the money is solved a little easier than at first, right? Because then you can say, okay, I have 100,000 active users. Now I can get funding, or I can sell my company. Or if you're selling something, you've obviously made money at that point.
And you can generate revenue also just by having that many users. So
so it's a different way of thinking,
Yeah, for sure. If you have a business or a startup, your business model should probably cover those costs at some point. But Nader, I just wanted to tell you one more time, I'm mind blown by the stuff that you shared with us today. To me, it was an honor to hear you speak once again. This is definitely something that I want to watch and rewatch it again. And yes, thank you for making the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it. It was very nice to have you over today.
It's an honor to be here. Anytime I get to be involved with any of your events, it's an honor. So thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and hopefully next time we get to hit the gym together when you're back in Amsterdam again. All right. Thank you, Nader.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been one more episode, I guess, of this meetup. This time it was more about React and JavaScript in general rather than Vue. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. And to the next time.